Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 287. This is of course the Patreon Drydock. However, as when this video goes live, technically speaking, I should be about 20 minutes landed back from my trip in the US. Rather understandably, the questions that are submitted on Patreon during the mid part and late part of February I won't have been able to get around to answering. So what you're going to get is the first half, the first 3 hours of the Patreon Drydock this week, and the second half will go up next week. As I say, pretty typical for a month where I'm off on an overseas trip. So, with that said, welcome to part 1, and let's get on with questions. Nathapron Hongsharon asks, rephrasing a question from a few months ago, why did the Swedish Navy choose 283mm from the Sverige class ships instead of 280mm or 11 inches? So there was a fair amount of cooperation and indeed licensing from Krupp by Bofors in the latter part of the 1800s when Bofors was set up, which, given that the German 11-inch guns, which predate the Sveriges guns, the German guns are also 283mm. They're officially 280mm 11-inch guns, but they're actually 283mm weapons. So I suspect that Bofors probably did either purchase initial designs or perhaps even some machinery for manufacture from Krupp, which results in the same calibre. However, you can also look at it from a few other different perspectives. If Bofors is trying to export, because obviously, a handful of guns for the Sveriges does not make a particularly economical gun development line. If they're trying to export 11-inch, quote-unquote, guns, then having something that has a common caliber and therefore in theory at least can use the shell and charge stocks that another nation might have if they already have German 11-inch guns, it makes sense, cross-compatibility and so forth. But as for why 283mm as opposed to exactly 11 inches or the nice round 280mm number, I suspect that's actually to do with windage, because if you look at the extremely detailed shell diagrams that are available from the period, you'll notice that, well, the driving band obviously projects a fair bit beyond the notional diameter of the shell. However, you'll very often see that the shell diameter is ever so slightly actually narrower than the nominal diameter of the gun. And this is to allow for windage, because if it was, you say, have a 6-inch shell that is exactly 6 inches wide, plus driving band, it's going to get very stuck, which could lead to some rather significant problems, because, at that point, even a layer of paint could mean that the shell won't fit in the gun. However, to cite a particular cross-section of a 6-inch shell that I'm looking at the moment, if you go with 5.96mm, or 5.96 inches for the exact diameter of the shell, that leaves you with just enough windage for the shell to freely pass up the gun whilst the driving bands are still engaged. And obviously there is windage in naval artillery, because if you look at those magical moments where a shell has been captured leaving the gun, or freeze-frame video footage that's been taken in relatively high speed, you'll see that there is a degree of smoke and flame that emerges from the gun before the shell does, so clearly there is windage involved. So what I suspect is the root cause of these supposed 11-inch guns actually being 11.1 inch is simply allowing for windage. So if you have your shells, you can now say, well, this shell is actually an 11-inch shell, not a 10.94 or 10.96 inch shell. This shell, take a measuring line or a ruler or whatever, and you can see this is exactly 11 inches wide, or 200mm, but that means the gun has to have an actual bore of 283mm or so that thing doesn't stick. Texas and LaShock asks, which nations built navies, actual full-on saltwater navies, that wound up being more liability than asset? Whilst rare, a full-scale navy that actually ends up being a liability rather than an asset does occur at various points in history. The two most usual times it'll end up being a liability is either if it's built in response to a past threat and that threat just then fails to rematerialize later on, so you're left with a big bill and not a lot else, or if building said navy brings you to the attention of still larger navies in a way that you necessarily didn't want for your nation's grand strategic plans. So I'll give you an example of each. You could argue that the American ships of the line that were built in the latter part of the 1810s and then the 1820s, 30s were perhaps more liability than asset, because they were built on the idea that a small number of full-on ships of the line would be at least a deterrent force to a hostile nation that might come up to the US coast to blockade it and attack the US. Essentially, they were working on the principle of what had happened in the War of 1812, where initially their big frigates had been able to operate relatively easily, but very quickly had been blockaded in by ships of the line that they couldn't fight. So by then building a small force of very heavily armed ships of the line, you could keep the ports open, or at least force the enemy to commit large numbers of ships of the line to your ports, which hopefully they wouldn't want to do. Unfortunately, it turned out after the War of 1812, nobody particularly cared about coming to America's coastline in force for a good long while, longer than the lifespan of these ships. And so the US Navy ended up with a bunch of very expensive to run, very large, very heavily armed ships of the line, and no particular use for them, because almost anything that they did, smaller, cheaper frigates could do better and for less money, with the exception of the occasional flagship show. So you could argue that just by being a cost to the US, they ended up being something of a liability. I mean, poor old Pennsylvania, one of the biggest ships of the line ever built, ended up completing exactly one voyage, which was from the dockyard she was built in to Norfolk, and then she was burnt there years later when the Confederates took over the dockyard. The other example where you bring unwanted attention to yourself could, again, it's arguable, but could be argued to be the German High Seas Fleet, because in the latter part of the 19th century, Britain, which was the biggest navy at the time, had a vested interest, as Britain, to be honest, has always had, of preventing a European hegemonic power emerging. And they'd spent most of the 19th century being worried that either France or Russia or both would try for this particular title. The French had a history of this. And the relatively newly formed German state, which sat directly between the two, seemed like the perfect counterbalance. I mean, how many times had Britain paid Prussia, Austria, etc., and various other vaguely Central European powers to face off against the French during the Napoleonic Wars, for example? The idea obviously being that Germany is a major land power. France and Russia are also major land powers, but if Germany becomes a bigger land power, France and Russia will have to spend more of their money building armies and artillery and all sorts to counter Germany, which means they can spend less on the navy, which is good for Britain because, as long as Britain is unopposed on the high seas, they don't really care what happens in Europe as long as no single entity is in charge. The problem with this, of course, was that Germany went on to industrialize very, very rapidly, and decided, thanks to the Kaiser Wilhelm II, that they were also going to have a very large navy. So Germany went from being seen as a useful ally of Britain against France and Russia to being such a major threat to Britain that Britain allied with France and Russia against Germany. And that set up the paradigm that gave us World War I. It's entirely possible that if the Kaiser had not been so obsessed with having a large navy, that Britain would have continued to back Germany as the counterweight to France and Russia, and that could have led to a very different World War I. The Rogue Chief asks, what was the deal with Kamchatka's captain? One could very well ask. The the problem, of course, is that we don't have any surviving interviews, as far as I'm aware, with Kamchatka's captain, or a huge amount of information about him. And of course, you have the wonderful game of telephone, which is, Kamchatka sees something or tries to signal something. So the captain will obviously say, I want to signal this. You then have the signals officer who actually has to make the signal, and then you have the other signals officer aboard the flagship that's receiving the signal. And somewhere along those lines, things could get misinterpreted. But at the same time, that there are some people who say, oh well, actually, the flagship misinterpreted the signal from Kamchatka and thought that, and it was actually not do you see torpedo boats. If it was an isolated incident, then perhaps that would be the case. However, as we know, Kamchatka was not exactly averse to A, signalling things that were in error, and B, signalling about torpedo boats. This seems to have happened multiple times, and blaming it on the flagship consistently misreading Kamchatka's signals, I think, fails on the basis that officer doesn't seem to have had all that much problem interpreting signals from most of the other ships in the 2nd Pacific Squadron. So if there is a consistent issue with one particular vessel, that suggests the issue is on the ship itself. Now, do you have a Simorovich, a very, very incompetent signals officer on Kamchatka who's trying to sabotage everything, or is the captain just sending out random signals? I think it's one of those things we're never going to precisely nail down, simply because we don't seem to have much, if any, direct testimony from Kamchatka's crew herself post Battle of Tsushima. But certainly someone on that boat was not doing their job properly, or just really, really didn't want to go to the Pacific. George H. asks, which World War II battleship fired the most main battery rounds at the enemy? USS Tennessee should be a strong candidate. According to the Directory or Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships, she fired 9,347 14-inch rounds, earning 10 battle stars. But Warspite must be close to that. I suspect that something like Tennessee, or possibly Tennessee herself, is actually going to be the overall winner. And that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, for sheer number of shells thrown at the enemy, it's going to have to be a ship that's involved in a lot of shore bombardment, because shore bombardments tended to be almost, and in some cases at D-Day, actual empty the magazines, go back, reload, repeat exercises. Whereas, no World War II naval battle saw a battleship expending its entire stock of shells from its magazines. So that's automatically going to give the ships involved in multiple shore bombardments a huge leg up in number of shells fired at enemy. And obviously, in the Pacific campaign, there's a lot of individual shore bombardments, whereas over in Europe, whilst you do have shore bombardments off of Sicily, off of Italy, southern Europe, the invasion of southern France, D-Day, and the support operations after D-Day, those are relatively distinct campaigns, if you like, and although obviously D-Day saw the expenditure of a huge number of shells by the battleships that were present, no ship, at least no capital ship, that I can immediately think of was present at every major European shore bombardment. And as I said, there aren't that many of them. Whereas in the Pacific, island after island after island after island is receiving shore bombardment. So there's a lot more of them. Combine that with the fact that Tennessee and other American standards, well, most of them at least, have 12 guns. So if you compare that to Warspite, which is still on frontline duty, where it's less likely to be engaged in prolonged shore bombardments up until, halfway through the war. Warspite with 8 guns, if it expends its entire magazine load, is not going to have expended as many shells as Tennessee with 12 guns if she expends her entire magazine load. Both ships carry around about 100 rounds per gun in their magazines, but that means if Warspite empties her magazine, she's fired around 800 rounds. Tennessee empties her magazines, she's fired around 1,200 rounds. So even if Warspite and Tennessee emptied the same number of magazines and the same number of shore bombardments, Tennessee would have expended 50% more rounds. And so the winner, if it's not actually Tennessee, is almost certainly going to be a 12-gun US Standard that was involved in a lot of Pacific War shore bombardments. Vokir asks, how important was the We Want 8 campaign in readying the Royal Navy for the First World War? If they'd only gotten 4 ships, as the Treasury was advocating, how much would that have decreased their capability to meet the high seas fleet? It was arguably very important, not necessarily because of the specific ships that it caused to be constructed, but the way it changed how the government was going to be spending money on defence generally and the Navy in particular. Because if you look at the numbers of ships laid down prior to the campaign, so you have obviously Dreadnought, then the Bellerophons, the Navy wanted 4, they got 3. The St. Vincents, again, they wanted 4, they got 3, because 4 made a good squadron to, or division of a battle squadron. Then, whilst they're still getting battle cruisers, they only get Neptune in the 1908-1909 naval program. And so by, early 1909, Britain has laid down a total of 8 dreadnoughts, which is the same as the Germans, except the Germans have done it in 2 classes rather than 4. Then the We Want 8 campaign comes along, and the government is pressured in part by them and also in part by losing an election, although just about managing to claw into power, to start spending significantly more on naval defence. So then you get more battle cruisers, plus you get the Colossus class and the Orion class. And the important thing about the Orion class is that with the We Want 8 campaign forming the pressure, it sets a precedent, which you then see for the next few years, of Britain building 4-ship classes of battleship, which is what the Admiralty had wanted for quite a while. And obviously, they're the first 13.5-inch ships in the Navy. And then you get the King George V class and the Iron Duke class. So all of a sudden, you now have 12 battleships armed with 13.5-inch guns. And then obviously it goes off into the Queen Elizabeth and the Revengers, and things start to escalate even more. But that core of ships is actually incredibly important because they are large, they are quite quick, they are very well armed, 10, 13.5-inch guns, and pretty well protected. And this gives the Royal Navy a core punch, which, in both numbers and firepower, is significantly in excess of what the High Seas Fleet manages to put out, going from mid-1909 forward. And that gives the Royal Navy a big leg up when it comes to World War I. The other thing, of course, is timing, because ships can be laid down, but you then have to launch them, commission them, and work them up into service. So the timing of the whole thing is very important as well, because if the Orion class, for example, even if they had been built as 4 vessels, if they'd been laid down in the following financial year instead of later on in the same financial year as the campaign managed to secure, then that delays everybody else by a year, which means that, for example, the Orions would still have entered service before World War I, but the King George V's would have been, the last of them would have been entering service just as World War I commenced, and the Iron Dukes would have entered service in 1915, and then you go on to the Queen Elizabeths. The Queen Elizabeths, some of them, 1 or 2 maybe, might have been in service in time for Jutland, if Jutland still happens when it does historically, and none of the Revenge class would have. At which point, what happens to Beatty if there's only 1 or 2 Queen Elizabeths around to save him? If there's only 1 or 2 in service, are they even going to be down in with the battlecruiser fleet? Will Beatty just have 12-inch and 13.5-inch battlecruisers with him? How worked up and how how ready to fight will the Iron Dukes be if they're only just about scraping into service? And as I said, with Jutland happening, does it even happen then? Because if the British are essentially short by 6-8 battleships, do the Germans maybe try and force something in 1914 before a lot of these ships have commissioned? Do the Revenge class get built at all? Because, of course, some of the Revenge class that were planned as follow-on vessels are cancelled. Do you get any Revenge class if they're all laid down? Well, they're supposed to all be laid down at a time when war has actually broken out. It could have had a huge knock-on impact, not just on Britain's ability to fight the First World War at sea, but also on Britain's post-war capabilities, because, of course, Britain went into the post-war environment with the core of the fleet being the Queen Elizabeths and the Revengers. If you only have the Queen Elizabeths and a bunch of 13.5-inch ships, that was possibly going to change the Washington Treaty negotiations a bit, but it's also going to significantly affect what the Royal Navy's capabilities are by World War II. Avoid Shisnos asks, if Joseph Chamberlain and the imperialist faction had gotten their way and created a unified British Empire, would it have had any effects on Britain's ability to build more ships in the lead-up to the World Wars? So this idea, which is also commonly referenced as the Imperial Federation, i.e. a unified federal state that's made up of most of the existing territories of the British Empire, including Britain itself, it had a degree of traction, and also, to be perfectly honest, their predictions were kind of correct, because they predicted that either the British Empire would have to federalise and become more of a union of equals, at which point it could continue as a major power, or if it didn't, then various growing nationalism movements would see the empire dissolve and Britain fall from its status as a premier world power, which, that's pretty much what's happened. Now, if the Imperial Federation idea had gone ahead, and there's a whole load of speculation as to how exactly it could or would have worked, and would it have been in stages, would it have been all at once, when, how, all of these things. So everything about it is a little speculative, but in terms of its ability to construct warships in the lead up to the World Wars, you are primarily looking at the timeline, because if, say, Imperial Federation goes through in 1905, then it could actually have a slightly negative impact on the ability to build ships for World War I, because the idea would cost a fair bit of money to implement, and obviously there's not unlimited amounts of money, which means money has to come from somewhere, and some of it would come from the defence budget. If it's implemented in 1900, dialing it a little bit further back, then the initial financial impacts of Imperial Federation would probably be over by the launch of HMS Dreadnought. However, I don't think it would markedly increase the ability to build warships, because at that stage there wouldn't have been enough time to expand shipyard facilities overseas, which, in heavily industrializing some of the overseas colonies, dominions, whatever you want to call them, was part of the plan. Because the problem is, if a country either has a very small shipyard or doesn't have a shipyard at all, and you want to build a full-scale naval facility capable of building and maintaining battleships and fleets, you've got to actually clear the ground, build the entire facility, supply all the machinery to the entire facility, ideally build up steel industries, forges and foundries that will make the guns, the armour, the structural components, etc., rather than have to ship them all over from the UK. And only then can you start building. And obviously that's a huge investment. So at 1900 Imperial Federation, you might have a slight increase in overall ship construction, but that would be potentially because of streamlined revenues going on, and therefore more money in the budget, and just using some of the additional capacity in British shipyards that's already there. However, if you take it back still further, because the Imperial Federation idea kicked off around in the sort of 1880s, if you get an 1890 or 1895 implementation of the Imperial Federation, then potentially 10, 15 years down the line, by 1905, there has been enough time to at least establish the first wave of heavy industrialization and shipyard construction, at which point, again, you've got theoretically a more streamlined overall imperial budget and a significant increase in shipbuilding capability. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be battleships. It could be cruisers and destroyers being built overseas, which free up some of the larger yards in the UK to either expand to battleship size, or if you're building, say, a cruiser in a battleship size slipway, because why not? That's what you've got the contract for. It frees up more battleship sized slipways in the UK. So I think if you're going to have a very significant impact on World War I, then you need to look to an 1890 or 1895 implementation of the Imperial Federation. However, any of these implementations, assuming that it survives as an entity through into the interwar period, any of those implementations of the Imperial Federation would have a massive effect on Britain's ability, or I guess at that point, the Federation's ability to construct warships in the lead up to World War II. Because at that point, by the time you get to, let's say 1930, there's been more than enough time for waves of industrialization, expansion, trade smoothing out, budgetary smoothing out, etc. Essentially the issues involved in creating a unified global spanning megastate to have been largely at least worked out. And then when the drums of war seem to start sounding in the mid-1930s, and now the Federation is having to turn its financial and economic resources towards re-armament, that becomes a lot more of an issue for Germany, because, if you look at the way the economics stack up, even completely neglecting the fact that they probably have an economic boost from having experienced at that point several decades of being a single unified state, if you look at what the US was able to produce in World War II, and now imagine that the Imperial Federation is able to do a roughly similar building streak, except that they're starting several years earlier than the US historically did in terms of major production. And of course, like the US, not the majority, but a good chunk of the Federation's industrial building capacity is now far beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe. Sebastian asks, the Germans had the bold or Pillenwerfer sonar countermeasures as well as radar spoofs. After doing much reading, I can't find information from any other country deploying such devices other than the US Navy copying the Pillenwerfer late in the war. Why is that? A lot of it comes down to that old saying, necessity is the mother of invention. The Germans, with their U-boat corps, were facing a campaign where almost any escort they ran across would be using sonar, and the escorts were getting increasingly more sophisticated at a rather alarming rate. Therefore, their research efforts would be devoted in significant part to fooling sonar, and obviously radar as well, when they're on the surface. So it's perhaps unsurprising that they're the ones who came up with effectively the noisemaker for underwater submarine activity. Whereas the British and the Americans were not up against anything like the concentration or technological sophistication of anti-submarine escorts. Now, granted, the Japanese did have a form of sonar. The Germans definitely had pretty good hydrophones and sonar, and the Italians to an extent as well. But German, Italian, and Japanese escort vessels were nowhere near as numerous as Allied escort vessels were for German subs, and Allied submarine targets were spread out quite a bit. So they were going after warships, they were going after the occasional merchant ship, they were doing recon, perhaps even sometimes conducting anti-submarine activities themselves. Of course, the Americans were also doing pilot rescue. And so the number of times a submarine from one of the Allied navies was under specific and direct threat from enemy sonar was proportionally a much, much smaller number of times compared to the number of times they're actually threatened by something, like, say, a patrolling aircraft or so forth, as compared to the Germans. Therefore, the pressure was not on the Allies to develop such a system quite as much as it was on the Germans, and then obviously, as you said, they can copy the German one when they find out about it. Conversely, what the Allies did have to deal with, which the Germans didn't so much, was acoustic homing torpedoes, and so the Allies invented the Foxer anti-acoustic homing torpedo decoy system, whereas the Germans didn't have such an equivalent device mounted on their surface vessels because, well, they didn't face a threat of acoustic homing torpedoes, and so on and so forth. So this is essentially why, especially by the mid to late war, you see some countries leading the field in some areas and other countries leading the field in other areas, depending on who's on the offensive and who's on the defensive and what systems they're having to deal with. W. Osterberg asks, I have a theoretical question about World War II. If Japan had not attacked the United States, but just gone after the British and Dutch holdings in the Pacific, do you think the US would have entered the war, or just sat back and continued to sell arms to the combatants? Well, we actually now have documentation about what the US would have done had the Japanese not attacked Pearl Harbor. And the simple answer is, if the Japanese had tried to, bypass the Philippines and ignore Pearl Harbor and gone straight for the Dutch oil fields, etc., the US still would have gone to war with Japan. And the administration in charge at the time had multiple ways of essentially justifying this. They had some tripwire units which were positioned between the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, which the Japanese would have to go past, and the hope was that the Japanese would engage them, thus providing an excuse. And even if they didn't, there is documentation now, as I say, now available, which has been mentioned actually on the channel a couple of years ago, which shows that the US administration was planning on just going, you know what, if the Dutch East Indies, the Dutch oil fields, are actually invaded by the Japanese, we're going to go to war with them on that basis. Kind of similar, in a similar way to how Britain got, technically speaking, involved in World War I because the Germans invaded Belgium, and technically speaking got involved in World War II because the Germans invaded Poland. It would provide an excuse for the US to declare war. So the US was going to war with Japan, whatever the case, if the Japanese attacked anybody with any significant holdings in the Pacific, simply because it would have been in US interests to do so, given US geostrategic policy, and in particular what the US was doing in 1941, because of course the US wanted Japan to stop its experiments in China, and more broadly, the US did not want Japan capturing enough material, land, territory, people, etc., to build itself up more economically as a threat. And specifically in 1941, of course, the US had put an embargo on selling oil to Japan, and, well, invading the Dutch East Indies is a rather neat way of getting around that embargo. So at that point, the US essentially would be left with a choice: either ignore it, at which point Japan can ignore anything else the US says, because it now has the vital resources it needs to continue its war in China, regardless of the US embargoes, at which point the US is left looking toothless, whilst Japan enriches itself and develops a Southeast Asian empire, with which it will eventually challenge the US for control of the Pacific, or it can try and nip that all in the bud now and go after Japan anyway. Brian Stevens asks, thinking back to your video on ropes, I've been wondering about sails. In the Age of Sail, what were they made from, and how much did it matter? Does a patched sail work worse than a whole sail, and did they carry specific swatches to patch them, or was it just a replace the sail sort of thing? In terms of patching sails, there would be some spare sailcloth left around with which you could patch a hole in a sail up. A rip in a sail, it was often held to be better just to, stitch the sail back together, perhaps with a small patch, but they weren't carrying, chests and chests and chests of random assorted sizes of patches of sailcloth. As I said, there would be some, but also Age of Sail ships would tend to carry several set well, not full sets of, but several large replacement sails, because it's not just enemy action that might shred a sail. You're also going to end up with perhaps storms and so forth, which might rip a sail to pieces. And so you're going to need some spare canvas for that. Of course, if your sail is shredded by enemy gunfire or by, other things like storms, to the point that you need to use one of your spare sails to replace it, well, now you have a ready supply of shredded canvas, which can be cut up into specific sections to deal with smaller rips, tears, and holes in other sails. In broad terms, a well-patched sail should catch about as much wind as a whole one, but you are going to have the issues of obviously stress around that point. You've very slightly changed the balance of the sail and its stiffness and all sorts of things, so that there will be a marginal reduction in performance, but the more and more you patch and stitch, etc., the more and more that marginal performance decrease starts to add up. There's also the intermediate stage, because sails are made up of strips of material. So if you have one strip that's got a really bad tear in it that's otherwise irreplaceable, and it's otherwise irreparable, you don't have to actually take out the entire sail. You can just replace that strip. In terms of what the sails were made of, now obviously this will vary across the world, but if you're looking at European navies, in the way, way, way distant past, Viking migration era, you're looking at wool. That then transitions over into flax linen canvas, hence the sort of slightly off-white beige colour of sails in the vast majority of paintings. And then at the end of the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century, you start to get a linen cotton blend, which then transitions into full cotton during the 19th century, and cotton ends up being cotton sails, the last kind of major sail type before the advent of steam. Hence why a lot of 19th century paintings will show sails as white, whereas, say, previously it'll be this kind of beige colour. And each material progressively is lighter, stronger under wind, and sags and tears and rips under its own weight less, and is less liable to issues with water, because obviously sails are going to get wet. Wool cloth, when it's wet, is incredibly heavy. I mean, not that linen is light when it's wet, but it's less heavy than wool cloth, and cotton is lighter still. Dave Collier asks, in World War II, the Japanese Navy had very elaborate rituals for abandoning ship, including the whole crew saluting as the flag is lowered, and the Emperor's portrait being placed in a lifeboat. Why were these rituals performed even in emergency conditions where any delay would presumably cost lives? Was this just a tradition, or were there official orders from the Admiralty? Well, in situations where things were truly catastrophically wrong, like, say, Kaga turning into a mobile inferno, they tended to just skedaddle, although they would still make efforts to save the Emperor's portrait. But in a lot of other situations, this, for example, is the sinking of Zuikaku, as you mentioned, they would go through with the full procedure. You can see the Japanese, their sailors and officers there saluting as the flag is coming down, even though Zuikaku is not exactly at a healthy angle of list at this point. And then they would depart the ship. Now, to a certain extent, you could say might as well, because if a ship is, I say, just sinking, if it is sinking in a manner that is progressing somewhat akin to Zuikaku sinking, which is typical for most ships that go down, to be honest, a few minutes saluting the flag and someone going to grab the Emperor's portrait is probably not going to affect anybody's rate of survival all that much. However, if you have a ship that's still under fire when it goes down, or is liberally on fire as it goes down, trying to follow those kinds of ceremonies could be something of a casualty event in and of themselves. However, you've got to remember that as with a lot of things when it comes to understanding the Japanese military, it is a matter of culture difference to the West as much as anything else, because to us, a ship is a ship. Well, when I say us, I mean general Western audiences. A ship is a ship. We understand it is a thing of metal, Sailors may get attached to their ship, but ultimately they understand that if the ship is going down, you generally want to get off of that ship as fast as humanly possible. However, in Japanese culture, at least World War I, World War II period, the ship was considered to have its own spirit. This was one of the reasons why there was a big furor about what they were going to do with the battleship Tosa, because it had already had its spirit investiture ceremony, as opposed to something like Akagi or Amagi, which were still on the stocks at the time of the Washington Naval Treaty, and Mutsu as well, for that matter. And you also, much as I like to make jokes about the Japanese and the God Emperor, they literally believed at that point that the Emperor was at least somewhat divine. And his portrait's then there. That's why the Golden Chrysanthemum, for example, is on the big Japanese warships. And so if a ship is going down, the ship itself is almost a life that is being lost as much as anybody else's. A fairly big one as well at that, obviously. So the Japanese ceremonies for abandoning ship are halfway to, if not entirely, towards being as much religious ceremonies as they are practical, let's get off this sinking ship operations. And suddenly you can understand why a lot of people would stick by those ceremonies, even in situations that might seem a little bit adverse. And to be honest, there is a parallel in Western culture, just not with ships per se, but you think about, how many times in battle, inland or at sea, when somebody has been killed, and you know that they're killed, because perhaps either you've seen them drop dead, they're not breathing, or the nature of their injuries are far too catastrophic for them to possibly be alive at that point, but you still get soldiers and sailors and so forth who either will refuse to leave their friend's side, or you'll get people who'll run out under enemy fire for no particular purpose other than to recover the body of their friend. Now, from a purely practical perspective, if your mate has just been, shredded by an artillery shell, and there is absolutely no question that he is alive, he is very, very, very dead, running out under machine gun fire and, the artillery fire that just killed him to bring back his body, from a purely rational perspective, makes as little sense as standing around on an aircraft carrier that's at a rather dangerous angle of heel and saluting a flag as it's hauled down. But because those kinds of actions, recovering people from battlefields, is built into our Western culture, we understand why people do it. It's pretty much the same kind of thing with the Japanese when abandoning ships, at least in that period. I don't know whether or not Japanese culture has carried on the idea of a warship having its own spirit, and whether or not the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force therefore would follow similar ceremonies today. Maybe if there's a Japanese subscriber or two, they can let us know. But that's certainly how it was back then. US Navy Sailor asks, during the island-hopping campaign of the Pacific War, many Japanese bases and manned islands were bypassed. Columbaranga in the Solomons, Rabaul, various islands in the Marshall Island Atoll, etc. So my question is, do we have any information on what happened to the Japanese sailors and soldiers on these bypassed islands? Did the US ever make periodic attempts to see if they wanted to surrender? What happened to them? Well, nothing particularly pleasant, because essentially what would happen is the Allies would bombard, strafe, etc. the island in question until it couldn't really offer any, what you might term, long-range resistance. It couldn't mount airstrikes against Allied units. Major coastal batteries would have been destroyed if the island sat along a supply route. So essentially it confined the offensive capability of the island to just its immediate vicinity. At that point, being behind Allied lines, those men are very unlikely to get any resupply. So if you're bypassed relatively early on in the Allied campaign, you're going to have fun surviving. I mean, obviously, some of these larger islands, there is naturally occurring food. There may be locals who are growing food, and you can maybe sustain yourself somewhat off of that, but you're not going to be getting resupply from Japan anytime soon. A lot of those areas, believe it or not, actually then ended up being turned almost into live fire exercise zones for Allied ships and aircraft. So Wake Island, for example, ships that were deploying from Pearl Harbor and heading to the main Pacific theater would sometimes go to shoot up a few of the defenses on Wake Island, primarily on the basis of, well, it'll annoy the Japanese who are there, it might persuade them to surrender, but it'll give our guns a good workout as well. Then, somewhere like Rabaul, once it had been effectively written down to short-range anti-aircraft guns only, was again used as a kind of live-fire testing ground for Allied pilots who could go up against some actual Japanese targets with a little smattering of anti-aircraft fire, but submarines offshore to rescue anybody who got too badly shot up and so forth. And it was just kind of left there because, well, you would occasionally check to see if the Japanese wanted to surrender, but honestly, everyone was pretty sure they wouldn't. And then after the war, once the Emperor had issued the surrender order, there was a period of going around basically collecting the surrenders of all the bits they'd bypassed. Singapore, for instance, was another one. This particular photo is the commander of the Japanese garrison at Rabaul surrendering, somewhat after the formal surrender ceremony back in Japan. Brian Smith asks, what were the advantages and disadvantages for those ships that had more than 2 turrets at the front of the ship? Atlanta style, Nelson style, Brooklyn style, Tone style, Mogami, Worcester style, etc., etc. So essentially, if you have 3 turrets up front, as far as warships are concerned, there are 3 main ways that this was done. You have the Atlanta style, where each turret is super firing over the one in front of it. You have the Nelson style, which is also the Brooklyn style and the style of most Japanese cruisers, where you have the central turret, the second one, super firing, and the other 2 beneath. And then you have the Worcester Mogami style, where the first 2 turrets are on the level, so the second turret can't fire dead ahead, and then the last turret can fire because it's super firing over the second. The primary strength of the Atlanta style layout is that all of your gun mounts can fire in the full forward arc. The primary disadvantage is it means that you have the maximum possible effect on stability and weight because you have essentially a double height barbette for the third mounting. Compared to that, the other 2 types have the advantage of saved weight because you only have 1 raised barbette, the middle one, or the back one. But the compromise is, of course, you can't fire all of those guns dead ahead. The Worcester or Worcester Mogami style one, where you have the super firing turret right at the back, closest to the bridge and superstructure, is that in theory, at least at higher elevations, you can fire all guns in all arcs ahead, but just not at closer ranges. And even so, with both of the single turret elevated setups, you generally will still have 3 turrets which can come to bear at either side at significantly more forward angles than, say, a traditionally placed turret aft, although there are ways to mitigate that aft turret aiming round forward like the Italians did with the Littorios, etc., but those have their own compromises as well. The flip side to that is that the Worcester Mogami style layout, where the, if you want to say C turret or third turret being elevated, is that your aft firing arcs may be a little restricted compared to the Nelson Brooklyn style, where having the second turret elevated, that second turret tends to have some very generous rear fire arcs, which, particularly if you're going with an all-forward armament, might be quite important. And even if you have some rear turrets, being able to bring another turret into action aft is still quite a bit of a benefit. ACC asks, Whilst they were never built, did any nation ever design a battleship with maximum possible speed and significantly larger guns than were available elsewhere in the world, essentially going all in on the firepower and speed legs of the stool and ignoring armour entirely? Such a design could have been particularly interesting in the treaty era, trying to outrange, outhit or outspeed everything else with a glass cannon design, but could such an extreme design actually work in battleship combat? Well, you say they were never built, but I give you the Italia-class ironclads. Now, granted, they do have some armour. They have a protective deck to guard the magazines and engine spaces, and the barbettes the guns are mounted on are armoured. But, as you might guess from the proliferation of portholes, despite this being a battleship, it does not have a single smidge of belt armour. And as you might guess from the 6 funnels, it does have a lot of engine power. So this is pretty much as close as we're ever going to get to all speed, all firepower, all the time, and pretty much ignoring most of the elements that make up armour on a traditional capital ship. The counter to not having belt armour, as was thought of, was the idea that this ship was incredibly heavily subdivided, a sort of cellular honeycomb style construction. So the idea was, yeah, if you do hit it, it's going to go through, but you will only flood a relatively small portion of the ship, and thus we can hopefully continue on. And in exchange for all those sacrifices, Italia was considerably faster than pretty much any other capital ship of the third period, and she carried the biggest guns on the planet at the time. And indeed, by calibre, those guns would not be exceeded until the 18-inch gun set sail on HMS Furious in World War I, and then later, obviously, the 18.1s on the Yamato. The main problem with implementing such a design in the 20th century, so the 1900s, 1910s interwar period, snarky comments about the Lexington against its contemporaries notwithstanding, would be that by that stage you have a proliferation of cruisers and destroyers with fast-firing, smaller caliber weapons that are still nonetheless capable of doing a lot of damage, and in the case of some cruisers and quite a few destroyers, very impressive turns of speed. This is not so much a problem that the Italia had to deal with. Destroyers and torpedo boats weren't really a thing when she was originally designed, and cruisers, such as they were, didn't have tremendously greater rates of fire than the armament on the Italia. But when you get to, as I say, the 20th century, this very much is the case. So you would then have problems if you did try and design a no armour, very fast, heavily armed battleship in the World War I, World War II period, of a cruiser or a few angry destroyers could get up close and personal, or even medium and not so personal, and shell enough of you to cripple the ship and put it out of action before you in turn could destroy them with your main guns, because the rate of fire difference would still be quite significant. Gallias of Martinengo asks, did the Kriegsmarine have workable plans to refit the Scharnhorsts with a 380mm 15-inch main battery, or was it mainly something just on paper to keep Hitler happy? No, they did actually have genuine plans, and they were partway through doing so to Gneisenau when the Battle of the Barents Sea put the kibosh on that. So this is Gneisenau in her last stages of life, when she's been sunk at Gdynia, I believe it's now Gdansk, in what's now Poland, at the time was occupied Europe. And you might notice that there's a little bit missing on the right-hand side of the picture. I mean, that'd be her bow, because after the damage that she'd suffered in the air raid that caused some rather major devastation, Kriegsmarine decided to, they had to rebuild her bow anyway, so they decided to refit her with twin 15s instead of triple 11s. But part of that involved removing the bow to put a different bow on. And then the work was stopped whilst the bow was off, so when she was scuttled, you end up with a bowless Gneisenau. Now, the reason the bow was removed was because all the way back when they were designing the Scharnhorsts, there was a slight miscalculation, and it resulted in the ships being a little bit nose heavy. So you see some of the very early photos where they just have essentially a almost King George V style, very flat bow. and they took on stupid amounts of water because the bow kept plunging into the sea. So they rebuilt them with the Atlantic bow, which, to be honest, improved their aesthetics massively, which somewhat mitigated the problem. It never entirely solved it. And then when they were looking at ripping out the 1111s and putting in twin 15s, they realised that whilst they had the space, the additional weight that this would incur meant that you'd end up with the same bow problems as the ships had originally, possibly even worse. And so a new bow was needed to essentially rebalance the ship. And that's what they were partly in the process of doing. So yes, they did have workable plans to do so. It would have been a quite involved process, and they might have gotten at least a good chunk of the way towards completing it before World War II came to an end, except for the fact, as I said, the Battle of the Barents Sea kind of, that meant Hitler went a little bit nuts about the surface fleet, and it never progressed beyond kind of the stage you see here. Lieutenant William Bush asks, in Drydock 293, you spelled out some of the changes you would have made to post-war British naval programs. If you were similarly given both hindsight and the resources available to the Royal Navy for new construction in the immediate pre-war years of 1935 through 39, what would be the top 2 or 3 changes you would make in the construction plans? These can be program changes or specific design features. For the purposes of this discussion, assume that the attempts to abide by the Washington and London naval treaties remain in effect, so 35,000-ton battleships with 14-inch guns and nominally 8,500-ton Fiji-class light cruisers are going to stay. And then for the 1940 to 45 period, it seems to me that the war years had some questionable builds with very limited margin for future upgrades, such as the Implacables, Minotaurs, and Tiger classes. That's the historic, not the as-planned Minotaurs. And I think we'd all be very interested in your thoughts. Okay, so if I have hindsight, my top 3 changes in terms of pre-war stuff would be, firstly, to introduce the amount of air conditioning that is present on British ships, which would make them far more able to operate in the tropics. That's not necessarily going to save Prince of Wales and Repulse, but the ability to, operate their full anti-aircraft suites might have some beneficial effect, and I'm sure a lot of crews would thank me for it. Other than that, whilst this might sound like a little bit of heresy, I would completely change up the order of modernizations for Royal Navy capital ships. I would still do Warspite as the proof of concept, because it's going to be relatively easy to sell that one to everybody. But when it comes to the historical program, which, ended up with Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, and Renown, I would actually turn around and say, I'm going to do Nelson, Rodney, and Hood. Now, that seemed completely the opposite way around, because they're the 3 most modern combatants in the Royal Navy. But I have hindsight. Remember, I know how World War II is going to go at this point. And my argument to the people at the time would be that, well, if we modernise our 3 most modern combatants now, other than obviously the under construction King George V's, then we have a decade plus, in theory, obviously not telling them that World War II is about to break out, of usage out of them before they eventually need to be replaced, which is a good long period, as opposed to the current plan, where we modernise the QEs, we get 3 or 4 years use out of them, and then we discard them, and so on and so forth as ships get modernised. Now, obviously, that does mean that Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, and Renown may be somewhat more vulnerable. Renown and Repulse, I would probably try and get some funding going to get them at least partially overhauled. So not the full-scale overhaul that Renown gets, but full modern radar suites, better anti-aircraft, replace the 4.4-inch with twin 4s or something like that, the twin 4 AA guns and so forth. So those would be 2. And I would also press for the much more rapid advancement of the 4.5-inch gun as a destroyer mounting and, elsewhere otherwise mounting as well. If I'm really forceful with that, I might even be able to get the tribals armed with 4.5-inch guns, and if not, then at least the subsequent 6-gun Royal Navy destroyers, the JKs, Ls, Ms, Ns, etc., and then all the wartime destroyers will all be armed with a good dual-purpose 4.5-inch gun, which I think will have quite a lot of benefits. For the World War II period, even though the design is obviously coming up from pre-war, I would get the Implacables. If nothing else, I would go, okay, with the Implacables, we're not having the dual hangars. We are having a single larger hangar, because again, horribly abusing hindsight here. And if that means we can get the overall height of the Implacables down a little bit, then maybe even make them a bit longer for the same tonnage and better stability. So essentially, they're never going to be quite the same size as the Essex class, but with a slightly larger hull and a single large hangar, tall hangar, it'll leave me with a pair of armoured flight deck aircraft carriers that can operate a decent number of aircraft, more than they did historically, which will also stand the Navy in good stead going into the post-World War II period, into the Cold War. Likewise, another carrier-based thing would be I would definitely push for the maximal Malta designs to be constructed, on the basis that if we have to, we'll finish Ark Royal and Eagle, the two Audaciouses. Perhaps we even move the names up to some of the Maltas. But anyway, the two Audaciouses that are under construction, I'll advocate finishing those as support repair ships, i.e. giant unicorn-style vessels, and just say, look, either we do that, and then we've got the Implacables, two support ships, and some big Maltas, and that'll be our post-war carrier fleet. All these masses and masses of 1942 light fleet carrier design ships that we're building, they're great, but, we've planned them to last 2 years. We'll let them run until the big stuff's done, and then we'll sell them off to a bunch of people for cheap. And the pre-war stuff is just going to have to go eventually. And whilst this might sound a little heretical, I might also draft up, if my pre-war stuff has gone through pretty well, I might try and draft up a wartime emergency destroyer design that is a little different to what the British historically did, because historically, it was 4 single guns. I would retain the 4-gun armament, but if my 4.5-inch destroyer-mounted guns have gone through before, I would try and put a pair of twin 4.5s in the super firing position, so B and X turret positions, and have more light anti-aircraft, probably pom-poms, maybe Bofors or something like that, and some 20 mils in place of where you would normally have A and Y turrets, the ones that are further fore and aft, because that way I retain the same amount of main battery guns. They're better because they're dual purpose, and I also have lots of light anti-air, or perhaps on the back, maybe just have more light anti-air forward and have aft more anti-sub stuff. Squirrel with a Flamethrower asks, in regards to the Battle of North Cape, why did the Royal Navy only send one battleship after Scharnhorst? Obviously, Duke of York was more than capable of dealing with Scharnhorst, but I'm surprised they didn't send another battleship or battlecruiser along just to play it safe. There was no guarantee that they were going to find Scharnhorst separated from her escorts, even though that's what happened historically, and one well-placed torpedo from a German destroyer could easily have let Scharnhorst slip away. Well, there's a few local and a few larger general factors that you have to consider. I mean, obviously, yes, firstly, a King George V class is massively superior to a Scharnhorst in everything except speed, but when it comes to the possibility of Scharnhorst's escorts causing issues, well, at this point, remember, they know Tirpitz is out of action, so if it's just destroyers they have to worry about, there are quite a number of British cruisers present. I mean, Duke of York specifically has Jamaica riding escort, which can, see off a number of German destroyers, plus its own destroyers, plus you have Burnett's force with Belfast, Sheffield and Norfolk and other destroyers in the area, so they're not exactly lacking in ships to take out German destroyers if the need arises. In overall grand strategy terms, you've also got to consider what ships could have accompanied Duke of York, because admittedly, a lot of Arctic convoys, especially before this, had been accompanied by at least 2 battleships or a battleship and an aircraft carrier, and often one of those battleships was American. In fact, even USS Iowa deployed temporarily to the Arctic area to look out for Tirpitz. But by the end of 1943, with Tirpitz as the main threat no longer an issue. Obviously, the pressure was off. And you also had various demands on the other ships. So, end of 1943, the US efforts in the Pacific have been ramped up for quite a while. So, all the South Dakotas and the North Carolinas, they have long ago done their sort of almost working up deployments to the Arctic. They're now all in the Pacific. Iowa, as said, has done her brief stint vaguely glaring at Tirpitz. At this point, towards the end of 1943, she's just coming off of being a essentially gigantic, heavily armed presidential yacht. Renown, which obviously now we're looking at British fast capital ships, is just about coming off doing the same duty except for Winston Churchill, basically taking Roosevelt and Churchill to the various conferences. So she's not really ready. And also, Renown's good, but if you're going to be doubling up just in case, you ideally want a full fast capital ship. Renown has better uses elsewhere a lot of the time. And then you have the other three British fast capital ships, King George V, Anson and Howe, which are in various stages of either coming in for refits, getting ready for deployment to the Pacific, or having just come back off of helping in the Mediterranean with the Sicily and Italy landings. So again, still in need of some form of refit. And on top of that, obviously, you want at least something back at home in case someone else deploys out, or for covering the next set of convoys, because you can't have one ship constantly covering convoys. So essentially what you've got is a situation where, yes, there are probably one or two other King George V's which could be made available, but if you double up the escort on one convoy, that means the next convoy probably isn't going to have any cover, which could obviously be something of a problem if you happen to choose the wrong convoy to escort, and then it's the next one that gets hit by Scharnhorst. About the only ship which theoretically could have been available is a rather interesting one, and that's USS New Jersey. Because, as I said, although it wasn't viewed as just a working up exercise, it was actually a serious deployment. A lot of the US fast capital ships up to this point had sort of deployed on Arctic escort missions as a form, I guess, of working up exercise before then heading over to the Pacific. New Jersey is actually the first US fast battleship after the sequence starts with ships like Washington to not do so. She just works up off the US East Coast and then heads straight for the Pacific in late 43, early 44. She's obviously commissioned much earlier in 43, but she is obviously in the process of getting ready for everything, working her crew up, which means that in theory, if people had decided that maybe Tirpitz isn't quite as badly damaged at that point as they thought she was, or whatever other butterfly effect you want to put in, there is the possibility that in an alternate timeline, Duke of York and New Jersey were at the Battle of the North Cape, taking on Scharnhorst. And, well, yeah, Scharnhorst didn't get away from Duke of York. The chances of her getting away from New Jersey, who is faster than she is, I don't think that's happening. Glenn Recafrente asks, if the Washington Naval Treaty had limited cruiser gun calibers to 6, 7, or even 7.5 inches, matching the Hawkins class, instead of 8 inches, would these have made for more balanced ships and thus actually long-term benefited all the treaty signatories? Who would have benefited the most, and what would cruiser construction have looked like in the interwar period? There would have been some benefit, to be sure. I don't think there would have been much benefit with a 7.5 or 7-inch limit, though. Essentially because the weight is a little too close to the 8-inch gun, so you might have seen people maybe deploying 777s or a stretch maybe 777.5s instead of twin 8s, or the US, which did deploy 888s, might have gone with 4 triples instead of 3. But broadly, I think it's going to force roughly the same issues, because your rate of fire is not going to be hugely greater. The armor you need to resist a 7.5 or even a good 7-inch shell is not going to be, much less than you need to resist an 8-inch shell. So you're going to end up with a similar flavour of what happened historically. But limiting the cruiser gun calibre to 6 inches, that I think you might be onto something. Now, there are two ways of dealing with that when it comes to your current vessels that are under construction. You can either say, okay, sorry, you're just going to have to stop that and or rearm them with 6-inch guns, or you could, like was kind of done with Hood with 35,000 ton weight limit, just go, okay, well, that's it. That's all you're allowed, and we're going to just draw a line under that and say, okay, you can have your 7.5 or 8-inch gun ships, but those are the only ones you can build. And all the other cruisers subsequently will have to have 6-inch guns. I think they probably would have ended up doing that if they'd agreed to that limit. At that point, you could actually have balanced treaty-era cruisers, because, yes, everyone is almost certainly going to have 12 plus 6-inch guns on their full 10,000 tonners, but a 6-inch gun is light enough that you could be still saving weight with that kind of armament, as long as you don't go full crazy and put like 15 or 18 of the things on. And the 6-inch gun has significantly less penetration, which means you can have armour which would protect you at reasonable battle ranges against other cruisers' main batteries without pushing the boat out when it comes to cheating the treaty displacement limits. And with all that saved weight, decent number of guns, decent armour, you can then afford things like extra torpedo defence systems or more stability, more anti-aircraft weaponry, etc., or just smaller ships. So whilst everyone would have benefited, I think actually Britain would have benefited the most, which is part of the reason why they kept pushing for that kind of thing later on. Because whilst, yes, your big 10,000 ton 6-inch fleet cruisers would have been quite nasty, at the same time, things like the Arethusas and the Leanders become significantly more viable. Maybe not the Arethusas, but definitely the Leanders, because they just have slightly fewer guns. They would still, in theory, be able to fit armour that at least gives them a modicum of resistance against even the biggest cruisers, apart from the grandfathered ones, that they're likely to come across. And in turn, they can also have as much of a chance of hurting those big fleet cruisers as anybody else armed with a 6-inch gun, which would free up the British to build a lot more of these smaller trade protection cruisers, which is what they wanted to do, as well as maybe a few big 10,000 tonners for fleet work. At which point, cruiser construction in the interwar period, I think everyone probably would have ended up doing a degree of that, because if the British start building 6,000-7,000 ton trade protection cruisers in large numbers, then obviously on top of their 10,000 tonners, then other people are going to be worried about just being swarmed by British cruisers, at which point you might see the US and Japan coming up with their own versions of the 6, 7, 8,000 ton smaller 6-inch cruisers to match the British, although perhaps more optimised for fleet work than the British ones, which would be somewhat optimised for trade defence. It might also, ironically enough, encourage a bit more uniformity in design within various navies, because if it's the same calibre of gun across your entire cruiser fleet, there's actually more benefit in developing a triple 6-inch turret earlier than most of them historically did, and just using it in lesser or greater numbers depending on the size. So your 10,000 ton ship might have 4 or 5 triple mounts for 12 or 15 guns. If you're building, let's say, a roughly 8,000 tonner, then you might go for 9 guns in 3 triples, usually probably 2 forward and 1 aft. And if you're really dedicated to the 5,000-6,000 ton, essentially treaty fleet protection - large flotilla leader style cruiser, then if you want 6 guns, aka an Arethusa, well, why not just go for 2 triples, either 1 fore and 1 aft, or 2 forward? In fact, I can see at that point maybe a small trade protection cruiser with 2 triple 6-inch forward, and the entire aft section devoted to aircraft for scouting and anti-aircraft guns and so forth. Sam Signorelli asks, at the beginning of World War II, US naval forces were generally not as good as the Japanese ones, just due to the difference in experience for naval and air operations, especially in the area of utilising air power. Beginning with Midway and then through the Guadalcanal campaign, this changed, and by the end of the war, the US was vastly superior in pretty much all respects due to a combination of US improvements and Japanese losses. At what point was there true parity between the forces? I don't think there's a very specific point that you can indicate and say this is the area, because at no point were the two navies ever truly on an absolute par. They would always have some advantages and disadvantages versus each other. It's not going to be a case of, well, on this day, both sides were exactly equal in every single field. But if you want to look at a time period where you could perhaps say that the strengths and weaknesses of each navy, on balance, maybe roughly made them on parity, at least assuming an equal field of battle, line up everybody of both sides in equal numbers, you're probably looking, I would say, late 42, early 1943. Maybe that's sort of a 3-month period from December 42 through to February 43. Now, the reason I say that is because prior to that, it is very easy to argue that US carrier air operations, at least in the way that they executed them, were inferior to the Japanese. The Japanese, as far down as the latter Guadalcanal campaign, when you have Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz Islands, show that they are still capable of mustering large strikes quickly and quicker than the US Navy, although the US Navy is catching up in that field. And the US Navy is still having problems with Japanese aircraft being able to turn up over their fleets almost unmolested, because the US is able to put up a lot of aircraft, but not really able to direct them very well. Those Guadalcanal carrier battles kind of proof of that. But the Japanese run into other issues like, the fact they get chewed up by US anti-aircraft fire, which the US has been pretty much superior in for the entirety of the war. They're just getting more and more superior. Whereas by the time you get into the early part of 1943, the US has had a bit of a refresher course in how to do fighter control and direction, thanks to HMS Victorious, aka USS Robin, popping into the Pacific and imparting British lessons in fighter control direction. So that's neatened that bit up. And of course, the Americans are continuing to accelerate their ability to get large strikes off of their flight decks and do coordinated carrier ops. So that's kind of the transition point for carrier flight operations, I would say, without commenting, of course, on the technical capabilities of the individual aircraft and who had what luck in discovering whose ship when they were doing the actual combat strikes. In battleship terms, by late 42, early 43, America still has a reduced number of battleships thanks to Pearl Harbor, but the North Carolinas are now on steam. The South Dakotas are beginning to come into service. The Japanese obviously have lost a few of their Congos, but they also have Yamato and Musashi now fully in service, so it's kind of a wash. But then once you get into, as you go on into 43, you have the Iowas starting to come in, which then the US has a lot more modern battleships and a lot more battleships period, and the Japanese are continuing to lose capital ships, and it kind of goes on. So the late 42, early 43, the Japanese submarine arm is still quite deadly, even if their doctrine sucks, frankly. And the US submarine arm is getting stronger and stronger with better and better subs, but is still fighting with the Mark 14 torpedo issues, but they're beginning to address at least some of them. So, and then you've obviously night fighting as well. So the Japanese start off with a definite advantage in night fighting. By the end of 1942, some US officers like Admiral Lee and so forth have demonstrated that with the use of radar, that technological edge, they're now better. But as some of the battles at Guadalcanal show, the whole of the US Navy hasn't necessarily embraced that, so there's still a little bit rough around the edges. But then by early 43, most of those issues have been resolved, and you end up with night action starting to go more and more the US way. So I think, very end of 1942, beginning of 43 is where you could probably average everything out and say if you took a fleet of, let's say, 2 Japanese fast battleships, 4 carriers, a dozen cruisers and 24 destroyers and half a dozen subs from both sides, you could expect most of their advantages and disadvantages to largely level the playing field and make it a roughly even fight. Once you get past that, even same numbers, similar kinds of ships, the US has a decided advantage. John McDonough asks, "Thank you for your answer about the shock effect on Enterprise last month. In Shattered Sword, there's a wonderfully detailed description about the steering casualty suffered by the Akagi from a near miss from a 1,000-pound bomb near the stern. The authors state that Akagi was very prone to shock-related damage as an older warship because the physical principles of shock damage were not well understood when she was constructed. So what did they know in 1942 that they did not know in 1920? As new ships, would Shokaku and Zuikaku have been better protected from this kind of damage? And once the danger was known, was there any mitigation possible for an older ship?" Now, I do need to stress that I'm not 100% sure about this, but I would say I'm 95% sure. So, with that in mind, I believe what's being referred to is the fact that up until the First World War, although, and you might find this surprising, although mines had of course existed for 60, 70 years at this point, there hadn't been a huge amount of study on the effect of underwater explosions on capital ships. I mean, you'd had mine losses to fairly major units in the Russo-Japanese War, but it's only really with World War I that the lessons really started to be taken in and absorbed. Prior to that, amongst the various defences suggested for anti-underwater explosions, so anti-mine, anti-torpedo defences, was just putting more armour, so extending the belt armour further down, which seemed logical from the perspective of, well, belt armour is supposed to protect you against big impacts and explosions from shells, so in slower speed impacts but with large explosions underwater, this makes a good idea. Do we put armour decking under the machinery and under the magazines? Do we make the armour belts deeper to protect against torpedo strikes? Or do we just, the other school of thought that was coming along at that time, just make the thing explode further away, which is your early anti-torpedo bulges? And it turns out that whilst having solid plates of armour to defend yourself against shells is a good idea, solid plating, very inflexible plating, is actually a terrible idea to defend yourself against underwater explosions, because water transmits shock an awful lot better than air does, at which point having a solid plate actually makes things worse, because the shock will hit it and it will be absorbed by the plate, either breaking and causing a massive hole in the ship, or being just shoved backwards and also causing a massive hole in the ship, just in a different shape. And then once you get into the early 1920s and the Washington Treaty and so forth, this is when you start to see the multi-layered torpedo defense system come into play, because people have now begun to understand considerably more about what happens with shock affecting ships. In some ways, there are actually parallels in the way that this works out to the way modern cars have evolved. Because for those of you who are old enough, you might remember that back in the day, a car, to try and survive a crash and to help people within it survive the crash, the thought was to make the car as physically strong as possible, because you look at, say, a 1940s, 1950s car, there's a car accident, everyone ends up in a mangle of flesh and metal, and it's not very pleasant. So the idea was, we'll make the car really, really strong, so you crash into something at 40 miles an hour and you get a slight bend in the front bonnet, and that's it. The car is broadly intact, and therefore logically the people should still be intact. And it Turns out it doesn't quite work that way, because whilst metal deals with deceleration relatively well, if you make it big and heavy enough, people don't. The human body's a bit more squishy. And they then advanced that to crumple zones, which is why cars are the way they are today and why cars are bigger than they used to be. Essentially, the crumple zone on a car is very closely analogous to an anti-torpedo bulge or torpedo defense system of the interwar and World War II periods, using space and deformation to protect what's inside from the impact of something from outside. And similar things apply to ships' systems. So transmitted shock from a shell impact, where it's above water, most of the shock is dissipated into the air and what's left is going through the ship's belt protection system, doesn't tend to reach too far into the ship. Even when you listen to survivors' accounts of ships that were hit in action, if you're deep in the ship and the ship is hit, you don't really notice it all that much, apart from maybe a brief rumble or something. Whereas anywhere on the ship and you get hit by a torpedo, everybody notices. And so things like air gaps, shock damping mountings, redundant systems, shockproof electronics, etc., these kinds of things tend to come in more with the interwar and World War II designs, although shock is still a problem even for 1930s designs if it's big enough. Whereas for a ship like Akagi, whose design fundamentally is rooted in the First World War, the Amagi class battlecruiser design starts before the First World War ends, even if the ships are not laid down until the 1920s, means that an awful lot of the lessons of World War I haven't strictly been entirely applied to the design, because apart from anything, well, Japan is not a frontline nation in that conflict. She's helping out, but it's countries on the Allied side like the UK that have the most direct experience. So of course the Japanese, through the Anglo-Japanese alliance, are receiving some of that data, but they're obviously not processing it quite quickly enough to incorporate into the Amagi design, hence why generally her structural features will be far more vulnerable to shock. Jim Smitty asks, another question from Neptune's Inferno by James D. Hornfisher. This time, on page 228, at least in the Kindle version, it states that a young officer drove half of Hornet's 5-inch guns into the stops, freezing them during the Battle of the Santa Cruz. My question is, how did driving the guns into the stops freeze them? I thought the stops simply kept the guns from going further, and it should be a simple thing to just reverse direction. What am I missing here? There are, in fact, multiple systems on a 5-inch 38 mount designed to prevent the guns firing into, their own ship. But primarily you have the training and elevation limit stops, which, as the name suggests, they stop the guns from elevating beyond a certain point, depressing beyond a certain point, or rotating beyond a certain point where that would be unsafe for either the gun or the ship. And you also have, as pictured here, the firing stop mechanisms, and they physically interrupt both the electrical and mechanical firing circuits so that you can't fire the gun when the gun is pointed in a specific location. And in the case of the latter, that's using a cam, again, as you can see here. Now, the cam, obviously, and plunger is a much more delicate mechanism, much easier to break, and thus my initial supposition would have been that perhaps something had broken there, because you can see there's a plunger. The plunger physically interrupts the firing circuits. If they hadn't figured that out or worked out how to reset it, then that could have been a problem, especially if, say, they'd run it so far beyond the stop that maybe the mechanism had jumped off the cam. However, in Neptune's Inferno, it specifically does say that the whole thing has frozen, not that they're able to wave the guns around but they can't fire them, which indicates that perhaps it's the training stop that has caused the problem. Now, in that case, I suspect it's one of two things. And for those of you who've done, DIY or maybe work in construction professionally, you'll know that these days most power drills have a setting when you're trying to screw something in, or even in some of them if you're trying to drill something in, where if too much resistance is met, the motor just starts clicking over because the screw or the drill bit or whatever is locked in place and won't turn any further. It's not usually a pleasant thing to hear, it's a high-pitched, rapid, clicking, whining noise, but the point of it as a safety mechanism is twofold. One is that it protects you, because if you've got a particularly powerful drill and suddenly the bit stops turning, well, now the drill's going to start turning, and that could be a very quick trip to the hospital with a very badly broken wrist. But if it's a case of, we've got a really good strong grip on the drill, or some other similar thing is going on, the other possibility is if the drill itself can't spin and the bit can't spin, but the motor's trying to do its best, the motor will then burn itself out and the magical blue smoke escapes and it's dead. I suspect, given that the 5-inch 38 mount has an electrically driven hydraulic training mechanism, that this may be what has happened. So if they've really gone full bore, slammed it into the stops, which again, there are mechanical systems and automatic cutouts for this, then potentially they might have carried the gun actually several degrees past the automatic cutout, at which point it could just be an electrical fault of, let's say that if you turn the gun inwards by 5 degrees, so you would be firing, say, 5 degrees over the flight deck, then it will cut out because it doesn't want you to do that. Well, if you've gone like full bore, spin, you might have actually ridden the gun 7 degrees over, at which point, obviously, it won't let you turn any further one way because that's over. But now that you're actually past the stop point physically, trying to bring it back the other way, as a person, you're reducing it from 7 degrees to 6 degrees and heading towards 5 degrees. So this is good. But as far as a very basic mechanical system, which is either safe or not, is going to interpret it as, well, 6 degrees is just as bad as 7 degrees, so it's still not going to let you move. So you might have potentially overridden the stop so far that it just wouldn't let it move at all. Potentially it didn't have the same kind of lockout safety mechanism, so it might have hit the stops, and the order coming through to keep going into the stops might have come through, and maybe the cutouts didn't kick in quite in time and the motors blew. Or potentially a halfway house where the motors kept going, overheated, and maybe a fuse blew out or something, an automatic breaker circuit, and in the heat of the moment people forgot about that or didn't have a spare supply of fuses or whatever, at which point the system was just completely dead of power and couldn't move anyway. Those, I suspect, would be the primary potential causes. For those of you who may be listening who actually work with 5-inch 38 mounting systems, if you're on one of the various museum ships that have them, if you happen to be able to go and have a look, or already have knowledge of exactly how the stops work on your 5-inch 38s and how you might accidentally engineer a way by which you could slam it into the stops hard enough that it wouldn't function, and that's different from the various potential methods I've just described, please let us know. And when I'm over in the States, hopefully by the point this comes out, I'll have poked around a 5-inch 38 or two with a specific goal of finding out how they work precisely. Greb asks, with regards to British 12-inch guns, on HMS Neptune, which was equipped with 12-inch breech-loading guns, it said in Naval Weapons of World War I that they couldn't run out guns simultaneously whilst using the training engine and hoists. Running out the guns on a battleship with turrets? Isn't running out the guns more of an Age of Sail thing? So looking at the quote in context, it's talking about elevation and training engines on the St. Vincent's, Colossus, Hercules, and then Neptune, and the way the St. Vincent's had, as it says, 6-cylinder training engines, Colossus and Hercules introduced swashplate engines, each ship has 3 hydraulic pumps, and then it says, reportedly, Neptune could not run 4 guns out simultaneously whilst using training engines and hoists. So I think what they're getting at, or what Norman Friedman in this case is getting at, since it's his book, is that as the weight of the guns and the turrets increases, and the number of turrets that would be in use increases, the power demands on the ship systems are getting greater and greater, And in terms of running out the guns, we're not talking about like pushing the guns forward. That's the job of the recoil system. It doesn't really need power unless something's gone horribly wrong. I think what he's referring to here is that by the time you get to Neptune, it doesn't sound like they've actually increased the total power output. They've just changed some of the technology behind it. And so what's happening is obviously the hoists need electrical power. The training mechanism needs electrical power. Even if it's an electro-hydraulic system, you still need electrical power to generate the pressure that moves the hydraulics. And then when you look at Neptune, you realize that she theoretically has cross-deck firing, but broadly speaking, it's going to be 4 sets of guns that are going to be trained out. So I think, and I stress, I think what he's referring to is that there wasn't enough electrical power generation on the ship such that if you wanted to train out the entirety of Neptune's main battery, or likely available main battery, whilst simultaneously running the ammunition hoists, there wasn't enough power in the ship to actually do that. So if you wanted to, train your entire main battery, you would have to temporarily interrupt the feed of ammunition to at least one of the turrets, possibly more. Or you could keep supplying ammunition, but just maybe train 2 turrets and then train the other 2 once those first 2 had reached their stops or reached their point of aim or something like that. I think that's what he's getting at. Wisdom in the Shadows asks, on a video about the officer's wardroom on Battleship New Jersey, Ryan mentioned that it was the XO, not the captain, who was in charge of the wardroom group, and that the captain could not join the other officers in the wardroom unless invited by the XO. What is the history of this division of power, and why, in this one case, does the XO have more authority than the captain on his own ship? Yes, this is definitely a thing. In fact, it's a shared feature between at least the US and Royal Navies, possibly other navies as well. I suspect most of the Royal Navy-derived navies have this distinction. And it goes way back to the Age of Sail, because at that point, remember, the captain, and even before the classic Age of Sail, even in galleons and so forth, the captain will not only have his own quarters, but he'll also have his own dining room, to which he can invite other people. However, when there's enough space on ships to have various messes and wardrooms separately, the officer's wardroom is presided over by the XO, and this is where all the officers who aren't the captain will meet and discuss. And partly this is a matter of decorum, partly it may be, partly there may be circumstances where the officers need to discuss the captain in private. Partly it's because the captain is supposed to be above everybody else, so that's why he has his own place. But it's rude to intrude on other people's eating areas and meal times when you're not invited. And thus, over time, this solidifies into a tradition where the XO is absolutely in charge of the officer's wardroom, and the captain may only enter by invitation. Now, of course, there do have to be cases where this kind of thing is relaxed a little bit. Perhaps on very small submarines, for example, there may not be a choice but to step through the officer's wardroom on your way back and forth along the sub, and such like. But on any kind of substantially sized vessel, at least, as I said, in British, American, and probably British-derived navies, you're going to have a situation where, by custom, the captain cannot enter the officer's wardroom without the executive officer's permission. Personally, I suspect that navies kept that particular custom in, if for no other reason than to remind the captain that, on occasion, he is not in fact God, despite however much he might want to be. Sapper Ninja asks, what's your best example in naval history of a Pyrrhic victory? Also, what's your best example of a battle which could be considered task failed successfully? As Pyrrhic victories go, the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands actually would be a pretty good one, because much like Coral Sea, on paper, in terms of ships sunk, the Japanese come out well ahead. Hornet goes down, the US fleet has to withdraw from the field of battle. But in overall strategic implications, and especially with the loss of Japanese air crews and everything, the Japanese Navy comes out of the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands in considerably worse shape than the US Navy does. So it's definitely a Pyrrhic victory. and a pretty classic example of one. As for a good example of task failed successfully, I'd actually point to the relatively little-known Battle of Saint-Mathieu in the early part of the reign of Henry VIII. So this was England versus France, and also Brittany sort of chiming in, because at this point Brittany was still semi-independent. And Mary Rose was present as one of the biggest ships there. However, the Breton flagship, Cordelier, I think is how it's pronounced, was putting up quite a fight. The French and Breton fleets both had fairly big flagships, and as far as the English were concerned, this was great because that meant there was a match-up for Mary Rose against the French flagship, and a match-up for the Cordelier, which was the rather large Regent. Now, the English forces, with their new, relatively new and experimental gun platform approach, did manage to rather nastily batter the Breton flagship, and it caught fire. Except that poor old Regent had come alongside to board, so as the Breton flagship fire spread and spread and spread, it also meant Regent caught fire, and both ships had guns, so eventually the fire reached the magazines and Cordelier exploded, followed shortly thereafter with Regent sinking. So overall, a successful battle for the English. They won, but Regent and the fleet generally definitely get a task failed successfully. It's like, well done, you managed to take out the Breton flagship, one of the largest ships in the world at that point, except you managed to take yourself with it. Oops. Rebel Skverl asks, I'm writing a story set during World War I and need something clarified. By mid-1915, would a Dutch ship sailing from Rotterdam be able to traverse the English Channel to enter the Atlantic, or would it be required to use the North Sea and circle around the British Isles instead? Technically speaking, as neutral shipping, yes, you could, but more practically, as you can see from this excerpt of a map, there's a rather large minefield problem. Both German and British minefields choking the channel just to the east of Dover. So, whilst it is possible, I don't think that many merchant ships would risk it, unless you were prepared to sail, as you can see from this plan, from Rotterdam, kind of skirt that minefield labelled number 3, head west, then head north, then head west again towards Harwich, basically going around the British minefield, and then head down across the Thames estuary and into the Channel. It's possible. You'd obviously, approaching that close to the British coastline, you'd have to arrange things with the Royal Navy. And, as you can see, it says, for further details, see the secret chart Z14, if it's supplied, which in this case it's not, but there will be clear routes through that minefield, but those are going to be primarily for British warships like the Harwich Force and the Dover Patrol transitioning up and down into the North Sea and into the Channel. So I don't think the British are going to be particularly welcoming if you say, well, can you show me one of your secret routes through this minefield so that I can just do my merchant trip? So, I suppose you could risk running the minefield as well, but I think the vast majority of merchant shipping is probably going to head north. Alternate historian Turtleduck asks, if the French sailor who killed Nelson survived the battle, what would happen if he was ID'd by British sailors post-battle? Would he be in any danger of life and limb? And if he made it back to France, what kind of reception would he receive in both countries? I think it would depend on exactly when he was ID'd, because there was quite a lot of strength of feeling about Nelson's death in the fleet. So, not beating around the bush, if once Redoutable had surrendered and boarding parties were, going aboard the ship, someone had gone, hey, that's the guy, I saw him shoot Admiral Nelson. I suspect if people weren't looking very, very closely at him pretty much constantly thereafter, he may have, accidentally tripped and fallen over the side, Governor. But you've got to remember as well that the prize crews aboard the French and Spanish ships were relatively small, and Redoutable foundered in the storm that came a few days after the battle. So if he wasn't ID'd immediately, but was perhaps ID'd a little bit later, he wouldn't be in immediate risk of life and limb, simply because the boarding party, the prize crew, probably have better things to do. But when Redoutable does eventually go down, she takes about just under 200 men with her, because she sinks quite quickly. And I would suspect at that point, again, if the boats rescuing the crew from Redoutable knew exactly who it was who'd shot Nelson, he may tragically have remained aboard the ship. But assuming that neither of those things happen, and perhaps he's just ID'd on the way back, again, sheer numbers of French crew as prisoners, he'll probably be relatively safe. There may be a few people who try and sneak in and do something to him. Back in England as a prisoner, that's he would be well advised to keep his head down and keep amongst his compatriots. But once he got back to France, given that some French captains and crew who survived did get quite well rewarded, Captain Lucas of Redoutable actually got quite rewarded when he eventually was paroled back to France, I suspect the French would have made something of a celebrity of him. Dylan Bartlett asks, if Turkey had been involved in World War II on the side of the Axis powers, what kind of naval operations by or against them would we possibly have seen? I mean, it depends when Turkey gets involved, because if it declares for the Axis in 1939, then, well, the Turkish Navy is not exactly large. There's less than a dozen obsolete vessels, including a couple of small cruisers, some destroyers and some subs, and of course the ex-Goeben, the battle cruiser Yavuz Sultan Selim. Now, the battle cruiser technically does pose as something of a threat. If it's 1939 through to when Italy actually declares war, well, then the Mediterranean fleet has some target practice to go after, and to be perfectly blunt, a single well-organised carrier strike, Taranto style, will probably put paid to the vast majority of the Turkish fleet. If they stay neutral until Italy gets involved, so then the Mediterranean fleet has Italy to worry about, to be honest, I mean, the British will probably keep their powder dry in terms of surprise aircraft carrier strikes on enemy fleets until they've hit the Italian fleet at Taranto, but they will probably then prioritise going after the Turkish fleet to neutralise the Yavuz as soon as possible. But the other thing you've got to bear in mind at that point is you have the Axis operations in Greece. So whilst outside of essentially make sure Yavuz can't go anywhere, whether that be by airstrikes, submarines, or if it is dumb enough to actually emerge into the Eastern Mediterranean, having Warspite go up and deal with it, the main thing is going to be, once the Germans have taken over Greece, there is now a contiguous Axis land route. Okay, they have to cross the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, but that's relatively easy to do at this point. And then obviously you have the Turkish border with the Middle East, which could potentially be seen as a way of circumventing Allied positions in North Africa, which are obviously based around Egypt. So I think probably the larger issue with Turkey joining the war is going to be the land campaign as they come down from Turkey, or not even the Turkish army, perhaps the Turkish and some German troops, or Turkish and some Italian troops, some combined Axis force, probably heading for the oil fields that the British have in the southeastern part of the Middle East. Joao Rita asks, on a tight budget, how many and what kind of ships would Norway require to make Germany think twice about invading in 1939-40? Well, first off, I think we have to emphasise a huge portion of Norway's potential to resist would also be readiness, because whilst Norway's naval forces weren't, particularly modern or particularly large, they could, in theory, have put up a much better fight against the Germans than they historically did if the Norwegian government had actually authorised them to, prepare for war and go onto a war footing sooner than there are German destroyers in Narvik Harbour. But with that said, for Norway to deter the Germans from at least trying to land troops in a naval fashion, honestly, you kind of want to take the Swedish approach. So ships, yes, you would need some, but you would definitely also need to integrate them with coastal defences. And that is possible on a tight budget because, after all, an artillery emplacement costs a lot less than a ship that has a similar number of guns on it. So if it was up to me, I would split the money between some modernised and upgraded 6-inch guns, probably, if I'm on a budget, to go in batteries guarding the various fjord entrances, particularly obviously Narvik, Oslo, etc. I would probably also want 2 or 3 fast mine layers, and again, if I'm on a tight budget, that would probably be maybe a 12 to 1400 ton adapted destroyer. So perhaps taking a leaf out of the Italian books and getting twin mounts for my guns, maybe have a couple of twin mounts up front, and then have the aft section of my destroyer dedicated to mines, and obviously the ability to deploy some anti-aircraft guns afterwards, with obviously torpedoes and midships. So that gives me a nice combination vessel that can deploy a small but useful number of mines, because obviously there's some very narrow choke points in the fjords. So if enemy vessels arrive, even if enemy ships are reported at the mouth of Narvik Fjord, there's a couple of choke points about halfway down where a destroyer that was already steamed up and quick on its toes could get out and lay a quick impromptu minefield and then stand behind it with torpedoes and guns ready to defend in relatively short order, certainly well before the Germans actually got there. And again, because of the narrow and rather confined nature of the fjords, this is actually one of the few areas where actual legitimate torpedo boats, i.e. things in the hundreds of tons displacement range rather than the 4-figure displacement range, actually also make a lot of sense, because in extremely close confined waters, there's much less opportunity for an enemy fleet or flotilla to manoeuvre, and you don't have to worry too much about long range. So at that point, as well as my mine layer destroyers, which I said maybe 2, 3 or 4 of, a couple of squadrons of torpedo boats, maybe a little bit like the Italian Speaker or Spiker class, would be quite useful, because then they're not so small that a single German destroyer shell is going to blow them out of the water, but they're cheap enough that I can get a fair number of them, and I can chuck torpedoes downrange, and I've got a few guns just in case as well. But the single biggest advantage, which would probably, well, I don't know if it would deter the Germans, but it would certainly make them pay a very, very heavy price if they tried anything, would be to, whatever I do with all my smaller vessels, make sure they have a good combined radio net so that the shore batteries and the various ships can communicate with each other as to the location of the German vessels, because the weather, as was seen when the Germans actually went after Norway, can vastly complicate spotting where they are. Ideally, you would want to put radar maybe on Norge and Eidsvold and have them backstop the whole effort, but I doubt the British are going to sell you surface search radar in 1939. John McCarthy asks, last month you answered my question about what Beatty could have done better at Jutland. Amongst other things, you mentioned keeping Jellicoe better informed as to the course, speed and composition of the oncoming German forces. Jellicoe managed a near-miraculous Grand Fleet deployment with minimal information, but what options might he have had if Beatty had actually done his job properly? Well, the primary one would have been an even better fleet deployment. Now, Jellicoe rightly gets credit for essentially doing an emergency deployment of his fleet, such that he manages to head off Scheer's advance. However, as you can see from this, which is one of the sections that I recreated using the track charts for the Battle of Jutland battle, except I haven't cropped this original, so you can see the carpet either side of the mat I was using. So you can see at this stage, the first scouting group, which is there on the bottom right, is beginning to turn away, and you have the main part of the High Seas Fleet coming up. But you can see the way the Grand Fleet is actually deployed in this kind of big arc, and this means that when Scheer turns away, there's still ships kind of moving through this arc, and the distances are not necessarily ideal. Also, you might notice that up to the top left there's a trio of little flags, and then up to the top right there's 8 little flags in 2 rows of 4. And to be fair, also in the centre left there's a few more to the left of 5th Battle Cruiser Squadron, etc. Those are the destroyer flotillas of the Grand Fleet, which have kind of been left in these positions by the Grand Fleet's manoeuvre. There's also, Beatty cutting across, which isn't helping. But nonetheless, if Jellicoe has a little bit more time, then instead of pulling the fleet from its roughly southeasterly heading in columns, and obviously then heading into a northeasterly line, which is then curved back to southeast as soon as possible, he could have done all of this earlier and thus had the Grand Fleet in a continuous line heading southeast, obviously ramping up the speed a little bit sooner as well. So instead of being in the position you can see here, you might have the Grand Fleet in a single line coming from roughly 1/3 of the way up on the right-hand side, where you can see some other units down there on the right. That's a 1st Light Cruiser Squadron, just in case you're interested. Running from there, basically up through where in real life, which is what you can see here, you've got 1st Light Cruiser Squadron, 3rd Battle Cruiser Squadron, and 4th Light Cruiser Squadron. So all of that could be Grand Fleet battleships. And then where you have the head of the Grand Fleet, so that's 1st Division, 2nd Battle Cruiser Squadron, 2nd Division, 2nd Battle Cruiser Squadron, and then just coming up to the apex, the 1st Division, 4th Battle Squadron. That whole line could be battleships, which of course is an even more perfect crossing of the T, and at slightly closer range, by then also clearing the northerly sector, so basically the left-hand side of that arc of ships. So that's the 2nd Division of 4th Battle Squadron, and then 1st Battle Squadron in its 2 divisions on the left, and with the battle cruisers, which you can see in the middle, not involved. Well, not involved there at least. You could then also clear the field for all of those destroyers to be in the positions roughly demarcated by the 2nd and 1st Battle Cruiser Squadrons, which are pretty much dead center here. And so what that would mean, as far as dealing with the Germans, is that you have the entirety of the Grand Fleet in range, whereas historically some elements of the Grand Fleet were out of range for a good chunk of this first engagement. Because they'll be a little bit closer, it'll be harder for Scheer to complete his battle turn away. He can do so, but he's going to remain in range of British guns for longer. Scheer, as you can see just on the bottom right there, does have his own destroyer flotillas, but again, with better organisation, you can have light cruiser squadrons and maybe a destroyer flotilla or 2 at the head of the Grand Fleet ready to head off any attack by them. And whilst you're having the crossing of the T by the Grand Fleet, you would then be able to order a mass attack by the Grand Fleet torpedo squadrons, i.e. the destroyer flotillas. They could be coming in from the north, so they'd be heading south or southeast, or south by southeast, and they would be launching torpedoes at the broadsides of the German capital ships, which complicates Scheer's battle turn away, because of course to do the battle turn away he has to spin his ships through 180 degrees, and that's going to slow them down and bring them back across the path they already were at. So if you've got streams of destroyers coming down and launching torpedoes in that area, then even if a torpedo is aimed in such a way that it maybe misses its intended target, there might be a ship coming back the other way which is now going to get hit. It kind of doubles up the chances of torpedoes striking home, all of which could seriously impair Shear's ability to withdraw. Now, to be fair, even in this circumstance, the majority of the High Seas Fleet will probably still be able to pull off a withdrawal, but it's quite likely that you might end up with a number of German capital ships, particularly because the Kaisers and Königs, the most modern ones, are leading the High Seas Fleet. Some of them may get damaged enough by a combination of shell and torpedo fire to be slowed down, at which point Scheer has a choice of leaving them behind to the tender mercies of the Grand Fleet, which will sink them, at which point no one's really going to argue that Jutland isn't an outright British victory, or he can try and turn back to rescue them, at which point that's exactly what Jellicoe wants, because he can just essentially repeat what he's just accomplished. Frank Bodenschatz asks, what did the Allies find after the war about Japanese aircraft search radar? Was it equipped on any planes, like was installed on the Avengers and such for night fighting and spotting ships and aircraft? Well, there's a whole section, if you want to read it, in the Allied technical mission to Japan that documents extensively the various kinds of radar that the Japanese had for mounting on aircraft. The single most common type was the Type 3 Mark 6 Model 4, but one of the major observations, you can see that this is a H-8K Emily flying boat, so equipped with said radar. One of the big observations that comes out of the technical report is that Japanese airborne radar, well, for one thing, it's obviously nowhere near as widespread as it is in the Allies, because the Allies are a bit ahead of the ball on that kind of thing and have built quite a lot of them. But also the capabilities of the Japanese radar, whilst there were one or two interesting features, because of course it's near enough completely independently developed, it was significantly less capable. So obviously this is an H8K. They're also commonly mounted on H6Ks, G4Ms, G3Ms, mostly multi-engined aircraft. There were some examples mounted on B5Ns, Kates, and B6Ns. So it wasn't that the radar couldn't be mounted on an aircraft about the size of an Avenger, but it was more commonly found on much larger aircraft. But as I said, the capabilities were not quite as good compared to the radar that you see mounted on the Avenger, which is the APS-20. The early model of the APS-20 is about 2.5 times better in terms of range for detecting surface vessels, and about twice as good in terms of range for detecting aircraft. And the APS-20 is further modified as the war goes on, so it has an even longer detection range against aircraft. So whilst, yes, you could have a B5N or B6N flying, looking for targets or incoming vessels, etc., on the Japanese side, and an Avenger with an APS-20 circling 100, 200 miles away, the fact is, if they are circling, let's say, 100 miles away, the Japanese aircraft is not going to know the American aircraft is there. The American aircraft is very definitely going to know the Japanese aircraft is there. So, for the most part, as I say, outside of a few interesting technical side developments, the Japanese were about a step to half a step behind when it came to radar technology by the end of the war. Fahrender Ritter asks, the Royal Navy before and during World War I took great lengths to secure the best coal from Wales and the northeast of England. Did they do anything to secure the best wood in the age of sail, whether it be by legal or monetary means? And were there any such measures for steel during the Dreadnought era? They did, but the means were subtly different for wood and coal compared to steel, and that's because wood and coal are naturally occurring products which you can't do a tremendous amount about in terms of their location and quality. I mean, you can plant forests, but that doesn't necessarily mean, outside of some basic forest management, that they're going to do what you want them to. Whereas steel is a manufactured product. So to get the best quality steel, that's simply a case of setting a minimum specification, making sure via testing that the steel meets it, and if particular foundries and forges keep supplying low quality steel, you just buy from one that doesn't have those issues and let natural competition take its toll. As far as wood, though, yes, the Royal Navy did quite a bit to secure the appropriate types and qualities of wood. So within the boundaries of Britain, there's what's known as the Admiralty mark, the broad arrow mark, which is essentially is in the shape of a broad arrow. So it's a trio of lines. Looks a bit like a swallowtail arrowhead. If you're into reenactment, you know what that means. Essentially, if you imagine an equilateral triangle where you've taken the base line out, turned it vertical and stuck it in the middle of the other two, that's the broad arrow mark. So the Admiralty would mark certain trees. You know, these are our trees. These are the ones we're going to use for future shipbuilding, and it then becomes a crime to cut those down, damage them, or in any way impair the Admiralty's ability to use those trees. When it comes to overseas, I mean, the whole attack on Copenhagen by Nelson was to secure access to, in some part, wood, particularly mast wood, but also, you know, general fixtures, fittings, rope, tar, etc., from the Baltic area. And sometimes, as the Royal Navy would do on a number of occasions, if there was a particularly good set of shipbuilding materials in a location, even if the Royal Navy couldn't necessarily use those immediately, they would sometimes just buy them all up simply to deny them to the enemy. Riva asks, just how good were the various optical rangefinders at being optical devices? Could they be used as ship-scale binoculars to, you know, look at things? And if so, what were they capable of? And if not, why not? You could use them as a pair of giant binoculars if you really wanted to, I suppose. I mean, obviously, if you're going to use the rangefinders on a battleship turret as a pair of binoculars, you're going to get the rather comical picture of an entire battleship turret panning back and forth across the ocean looking for something. Slightly less silly if you imagine using one of the directors up top. This is obviously USS New Mexico, and you can see there's rangefinders obviously in both of her forward turrets, and you can see there's also two separate rangefinders on two separate director spotting stations up top on her superstructure. And there's obviously more further back, but those are the four forwardmost ones. However, the vast majority of optical rangefinders do not have a variable zoom. They have a fixed magnification, usually something like 20 or 25 times magnification. So, you know, you have to take that into account. You're going to get a very fixed image of what's going on out there, just slightly bigger than what you'd see with your eyes. But to be fair, an awful lot of binoculars at that stage in time had fixed magnification values. The ability to zoom in and out with binoculars is largely, though not entirely, a relatively new thing. Obviously, with telescopes and such, you can do a degree of zoom as well. The main disadvantage that you're going to have with using your rangefinders as giant binoculars is, of course, whether they're coincidence or stereoscopic, they're going to be projecting slightly different images. So finding and locking onto a target is going to be a little bit difficult compared to just using a set of binoculars you can point at something you've seen. The flip side is, of course, once you have managed to find something, if you do the correct alignment procedures, then you also know exactly how far away it is, as opposed to just a pair of handheld or bridge-mounted binoculars, which will just tell you that a thing is there and perhaps give you a slightly better view. Yokosuka Girls High School training ship Harikaze asks, in the novel HMS Saracen, a fictional third Erebus-class monitor, she engages an Italian battleship and manages to score enough hits to make it turn away. Would a ship like the fictional Saracen have stood any chance of doing enough damage to a battleship in a straight-up fight to make it turn away or even sink? And do you know of any occasions where a monitor of World War I or World War II engaged a surface unit? So there was actually one rather notable engagement where monitors, or a monitor, well two actually, faced off against surface ships that could be classed as capital ships. That was the Battle of Imbros, where the monitor M28 and this monitor, the Abercrombie-class HMS Raglan, faced off against the ex-Goeben Yavuz Sultan Selim. It did not go well for Raglan. She got a relatively early hit to her spotting directing top, which you can see up there at the top, and then, monitors not being the best armoured vessels in the world, took repeated hits, and eventually the magazine was also hit. Twin 14-inch turret was also knocked out about halfway through the fight. So, yeah, the big problem with monitors taking on capital ships is, although they technically have the firepower, they only obviously have a single turret, usually a twin turret, but sometimes only a single gun, and they have very little in the way of protection, and they're usually pretty slow, which, compared to a battleship with multiple guns, armour and speed, puts them at a serious disadvantage. Also, since they're usually going to be used for shore bombardment, they will normally be carrying lots and lots of high explosive shells and little to no armour-piercing shell. However, with all that said, Saracen being a fictional Erebus class, so she would have twin 15-inch guns, the ships do have rangefinders. That's why World War I and World War II British monitors have these big tripod masts. They're not the world's biggest and best rangefinders like you'd find on a battleship, but they are there and they have a reasonably high vantage point. And if the ship is carrying a supply of armour-piercing shells, then it does have the capability to reach out and hurt a battleship in certain circumstances before it gets destroyed itself. So a lot of it would depend on the exact circumstances of the engagement. Now, I've not read the novel, so I don't know, but for a monitor to get the drop on a battleship, you need to have one or more of the following conditions. Ideally, the battle should take place at close range, because that minimizes the effect of having a smaller rangefinder. It also means that you're more likely to score hits generally, and at close range, your shells are much more likely to go through, and the battleship's armour is much less likely to help it, which evens the playing field slightly. You could also have the engagement at night, or in adverse weather like fog, which would help to cut down the range a bit, rather than perhaps coming around a headland or something. So, for example, if you're going to be operating in the Mediterranean with an Erebus-class monitor and there's a random Italian battleship out there, your ideal circumstances would be you have armor-piercing shells and you have them loaded, because presumably you're in transit at sea and there's a small chance you might run into something big. Ideally, you'd want radar, and for it to be a moonless night. So the Italian ship, which most likely is not going to have any radar, won't see you, but you can see it, which allows you to get to action stations, have the guns loaded, aimed, ready to fire, and essentially pull off a mini Matapan style thing. And of course you can apply this to fog or obstructing islands or whatever other visual impairment you want to put in. And then you get to open fire first when the enemy's not really expecting it. And then at that point, hopefully you can get 2-3 salvos off before the enemy gets a chance to respond. And if you get some nice hits in, that could damage the enemy ship badly enough that it's forced to break off, or possibly even sink if you get really lucky. But there are any number of hits which could cause a ship to break off to reassess. I mean, apart from anything, if you're ambushed at close range by something firing 15-inch guns, you do want to break off to reassess generally. But something like a hit similar to what happened to Bismarck early on, smash into the conning tower, create a massive blast and spray of shrapnel, command crew goes down, forward fire, main fire control goes down, rangefinders smashed, control cables cut, massively impairs the ship's ability to organise to fight back and fight back accurately until local control is established. You could perhaps hit the funnels, a bit like Warspite did with Giulia Cesare, causing massive drop in speed and significant issues in your engine rooms. And of course, you go for the traditional hull shots and cause some rather nasty waterline flooding in the machinery spaces or something like that. So yes, it is possible, but you would have to stack the environmental circumstances quite heavily in the monitor's favour, or have a really bad battleship crew for the monitor to have a decent chance. Capitano Lorenzo asks, how were depth settings changed on depth charges after takeoff whilst carried by aircraft, or could it be done whilst airborne at all? So the method for changing the depth setting on a depth charge is ultimately you get a wrench and turn the appropriate dial on the depth charge. Now, as to whether you can do this on an aircraft, it greatly depends on the aircraft in question, because some aircraft had to carry their depth charges just mounted out on the wings. In that case, sorry, you're stuck with the depth setting that you had when you took off. On the other hand, some aircraft would carry their depth charges in their bomb bays, and you could always access the bomb bay and just hope the pilot didn't open the doors while you were there. So you could make adjustments, technically speaking, whilst you're in flight. And one or two aircraft even had the depth charges stored internally and then sent out onto the wings whilst in flight. Although in any single mission, the chances of you finding and engaging a U-boat were relatively low, so needing to reload from internal weapon storage was a vanishingly rare occurrence for the few aircraft that did actually have that kind of capability. But nonetheless, if you had some kind of internal storage for the weapons, then yes, you could manually adjust the depth settings in flight. However, there's a rather large asterisk over all that, which is why would you need to? Because unlike a ship, which has sonar, which can then look for submarines at all sorts of depths, an aircraft can only really spot submarines that are either on the surface or just below the surface, which means as long as you set your depth charges to an appropriately shallow depth, 25 feet is often quoted, then you can just drop those and they'll do damage to anything that you can realistically spot. You could, in theory, have depth charges set to a much deeper depth if you perhaps think that you're going to spot a submarine that's diving, and by the time you get over there, it will have gone deep. But if a submarine's gone down 100 feet, unless it's, high noon in the Mediterranean with very pale, sandy seafloor, maybe a couple of 100 feet down, the chances of you spotting the thing and therefore knowing where to drop your charges is pretty slim. Wyoming Iceberg asks, in the loading screen for World of Warships, there's a depiction of an Italian cruiser and a British cruiser close enough to, in real-world terms, swap paint. The ship on the right is obviously British because of the Queen Anne Tower superstructure and the apparently shorter middle gun shown in the turrets. Why did the British do this? Was the problem a peculiarity of that particular gun in that configuration? It seems unique to British triple 6-inch turrets. Yeah, if I had to hazard a guess, that twin 4.5 secondary there probably makes that the Neptune, the Tier 9 British cruiser in World of Warships. Now, as far as why you've got that setback, it's to do with a problem that most navies had to deal with in some way, shape or form, which is the problem of shell interference on triple or quadruple turrets. Essentially, if you have multiple pieces of heavy artillery in close proximity to each other, even in twin turrets if you put them too close, the blast of each gun from the muzzle will interfere with the air nearby, which means it will also interfere with the flight path of the shell next to it, which then results in inaccuracy. Now, the standard way of solving that is either just space your guns out a bit more, or if you can't, for whatever reason, you put what are called delay circuits or delay coils in. So you stagger the firing of the guns ever so slightly so the worst of the shockwave has passed by the time the next shell from the adjacent barrel emerges. And whilst British 6.6-inch guns, as found on the Towns and the Crown Colonies, etc., did feature delay coils in the end, one of the ways to try and mitigate the whole thing was also just to physically step the middle gun back. So it is exactly the same length of gun, it's just sighted slightly further back in the turret. And the idea then is obviously the primary shockwave emerges at a different position relative to the adjacent gun barrels, and so you don't get as much interference. It also, in some ways, makes things slightly easier in the turret for loading the guns because it displaces the central gun crew away from the other two, which actually gives them slightly more space to play with, respectively. So, yeah, that's why you have this offset. The Freaker86 asks, despite Germany and the British being at war with each other, how did the two lifeboat institutions, the RNLI and the DGZRS, get along with each other? Assuming their lifeboats somehow met at sea despite the distance from home shores, was it an attitude of live and let live, or were they cooperating to some extent? And is my assumption correct that both institutions rescued any people, no matter friend or foe? I'm not immediately aware of lifeboats from both sides actually meeting up in mid-Channel or mid-North Sea, as again, at least as far as I know. But broadly speaking, yes, both organisations, although the German side of things was kind of absorbed into the Luftwaffe fairly quickly, would rescue anyone that they found at sea. In fact, early on in the war, a formation of British bombers which were set upon and mauled by German fighters and had a number of aircraft go down at sea actually had quite a number of their flight crew pulled out of the water by flying boats, float planes and lifeboats from the German lifeboats and air sea rescue services, which had gone out specifically to find and rescue them, despite obviously the fact that they were the enemy. And then, of course, you have the little floating life buoys, miniature life-saving stations, basically small bunk and compartments with a little cooker and everything, where if you went down, you could go and climb aboard, and then you would be a little bit better off than floating around in a life jacket or in a tiny inflatable raft. And those things, mostly deployed by the Germans, would be inspected by ships or lifeboats from both sides on occasion. The British would deploy their own version a little bit later. So yeah, pretty much outside of a few incidents with lifeboats where they were mistakenly fired upon, or one would at least hopefully mistakenly fired upon, generally speaking, the life-saving organisations on both sides just got on with their jobs, and if they found someone in the sea, they would be rescued, just whether or not they were friendly, depended on whether or not they were a prisoner or just lucky to be fished out of the water. The only exception to that rule was German air-sea rescue aircraft, which were eventually set as valid targets for Allied fighters and so forth, mostly because they started to show up around active Luftwaffe formations, which made the Allies, especially early on the British, a bit suspicious. And when some of the crashed, shot down rescue aircraft were examined, they found that the pilots had been noting down the position, course, speed, and composition of various convoys, which the British then held to not really be in the spirit of life-saving only work, and thus they registered them as valid targets. Make of that judgment what you will. Fulton Henderson asks, in 1919, Admiral Jellicoe made his tour of the Empire and reported to the various dominions on naval matters. Each report was 4 volumes, of which only the first volumes are publicly accessible. Do you have any additional information on the contents of volumes 2 to 4 for Canada, Australia and New Zealand, in particular his recommendations for locations and scopes of new shipyards and bases? And to what degree did the Dominions adopt his recommendations during the interwar period? Well, the short answer to how much of his recommendations were adopted in the interwar period is very little, partly for economic reasons, but mostly because, obviously, in 1919, Jellicoe was making his recommendations based pretty much on how Britain managed its empire pre, during, and immediately post-World War I, whereas for the interwar period, the restrictions of the Washington Naval Treaty pretty much wiped away a good chunk of what he would otherwise have assumed could be done. Now, with regards to volumes 2 to 4 for the various visits, there was also a visit to India, for example. Those are the ones that marked confidential and classified in the original sorts. You can actually view all of them. They're available in the British Library of all places. So if you do happen to want to go and review them or ask the British Library to give you extracts from them, you need to quote manuscript or MS numbers 49046 through 49057, of which 46 and 47 are India, 48 through 51 are Australia, 52 through 54 is New Zealand, and 55 through 57 is Canada. Unfortunately, obviously, the British Library's data system for the last few months has been locked out thanks to a cyber attack, and I haven't previously gone up there to look through all those reports extensively, and maybe I will do at some point in the future. Michael Gilson asks, with the Essex flood, the US Navy had no need for anything like the Royal Navy Light Fleet Carrier program, but would there have been any chance of them building something similar to supply the Allies? As a hypothetical US Navy Light Fleet Carrier, how about taking the Commencement Bay design, extending the hull about 100 feet and inserting 2 of the machinery sets of the Buckley class with 4 screws, 2 geared and 2 electric? The problem you're going to have is even an extended Commencement Bay, if you're going to get it up to the scale of a British light fleet carrier, you're going to also have to widen the hull, reconfigure the island and the flight deck, and all sorts of things, to the point that you may as well start a new design. Otherwise, you just end up with something that's a little less capable than a light fleet carrier. And that kind of ties into the other issue, which is that US Navy vessels as a whole generally, even to these days, but especially back in World War II, generally need somewhat more crew to run, which makes them less attractive to people with smaller navies who obviously don't want or can't afford to have very large crews. Whereas the light fleet carriers don't need too many people to run. I mean, this is one of the reasons why when Canada had the option of running light fleet carriers or Essex class, I mean, the Essex class are much superior carriers in terms of capability, but it was actually cheaper to run a couple of light fleets instead in terms of manpower. And ultimately, at the end of the day, all you'd end up with is 2 competing light fleet carrier designs, and there's only so many navies in the Western Allies who can operate aircraft carriers, so you'd end up with a bunch of surplus going to scrap from one side or the other anyway. Matt Kidd asks, what do you think of US Congress's insistence for naval gunfire support to be available after World War II? Without getting into specifics, because that ends up getting entrenched in the politics of it all and everything, broadly speaking, for a navy that is going to be expected to go overseas and potentially conduct opposed landings or otherwise enforce a nation's will on another nation, having offshore naval gunfire support in reasonably heavy calibers is fundamentally a necessary thing. Well, there's a few different reasons, but one of them is that onshore fire support is one of the things where actually carrier aircraft have certain limitations. Because if you're going up against somebody who is so far below you on the tech tree that they don't have any meaningful air defense, well, okay, at that point you probably don't need offshore gunfire support either, because you can effectively just roll up with a few tanks on some landing craft and you're already vastly in command of the area. Or, no air defense, you can bomb them as well, I guess. But if you're going up against anyone with anything even approaching a halfway decent military, they are going to have anti-aircraft defenses. And anti-aircraft defenses are, relatively speaking, cheap, numerous, and portable. And aircraft are relatively expensive. And if you're talking about an aircraft carrier or 2 or 3, there is a finite supply of them, which means that if you are trying to conduct an opposed landing or something like that, then you run the risk, if you're going to rely purely on carrier-based aviation, of actually not getting the results you need. Because if you go too low, you will end up losing a lot of aircraft and pilots, which then means you have to do a bunch of search and rescue operations. Or you go high, and for a lot of the Cold War, that meant you weren't going to be tremendously accurate. I mean, obviously, later on you did get laser-guided weapons and so forth coming in, but there are still, high-altitude surface-to-air missiles and so forth. Whereas if you rock up with a battleship, or even a large heavy cruiser like a Des Moines, whilst you can wield weapons that will threaten a battleship, coast defense guns, surface missiles and so forth, the investment required to meaningfully threaten such a ship is considerably greater than the investment you need to reasonably threaten a carrier aircraft. And that makes the whole situation a lot more complicated for the people that you're going after. And also, those investments tend to be somewhat larger, somewhat more fixed, and therefore much more easily targeted. And even if they're road mobile, they're still fairly obvious. So, yeah, broadly speaking, from a tactical perspective, for something like the US Navy, being able to provide naval gunfire support directly on call is, a fairly good idea. I mean, if the Royal Navy had still had Vanguard in ready-use mothballs, then, Vanguard's 15-inch guns would have made the Falklands campaign, for instance, so much easier. October Nid asks, would the 1930s Deutschlands have been better off with only 4 11-inch guns and the weight saved spent on more armour, speed, range, and secondary battery? Whilst there are plenty of improvements I would make to the Deutschlands, the amount of weight that you would save by deleting a couple of the 11-inch guns isn't going to buy you all that much in other places. I mean, deleting the guns themselves will save you about 100 tons, and then downsizing the turrets to a pair of twins, and obviously the barbettes, the magazines, etc., that'll save you a bit more weight, but you're probably still only talking maybe 300 tons, give or take a bit. I would reckon, at least. Maybe you might save a bit more, but even if we were really generous and said maybe 400 tons saved weight, what can you buy with 400 tons? I mean, it's a fair amount of weight to play with, but given the armor protection that was available on the Lutzow-Deutschland class, that's not enough weight to really upgrade the armor to be, comprehensively 8-inch proof. So, and we already know the central armor, the Citadel, was pretty much 6-inch proof already. So I don't think there's a huge amount to be gained from mildly up-armoring the thing with that weight saving. Speed-wise, well, that's more power. Maybe you could get more power in there. I mean, that's a fair amount of extra machinery you could get in. That might be served then best by actually, and I know this sounds a little bit repetitive from me, but actually going for an all-forward design at that point. 2 twins up front, all super firing. Yes, you have to move everything slightly back to accommodate it, but then it means you've got pretty much the entire run of the stern for enhanced machinery and maybe a bit more fuel. That probably, of all the things, is the thing that's worth the most, because one of the big problems with the Deutschlands was they couldn't outrun packs of cruisers, so giving them that ability to at least match pace with them would be quite helpful. Secondary battery, their secondary battery was okay for what they were at the time they were designed. So yeah, if you're going to do anything with the saved weight, I would put it into more speed and range. The almighty Hypnotoad asks, I recently got hold of an original copy of Fighting Ships 1905-06 by Fred T. Jane, and whilst trawling through the book, I found some interesting remarks. Dreadnought is mentioned as being a modified Lord Nelson, and he questions if she can use all the guns present given her assumed layout as a pre-Dreadnought. USS South Dakota is stated to have a uniform 10 or 12-inch main battery and is said to have been highly based on designs done by Colonel Cuniberti. Meanwhile, Jane also assumes that any new French battleships would revert back to single gun turrets, or even further back to simply single mount casement main battery guns. What information was available to lead Fred Jane to print this incorrect information, and was there any effort on the part of the mentioned navies to spread disinformation to prevent publishers like Fred Jane from learning what was actually being built, and how did he go about getting his information at this time? The 1900s, as I've mentioned in some previous dry docks, are really a period of transition when it comes to what we today would call operational security. At the beginning of the 1900s, and definitely back in the 1890s, and obviously further back still, the construction of major warships of new and innovative natures was something for public celebration, and what new systems were going to be installed and how were often discussed quite liberally in the public sphere long before the ship had even hit the water. There was, of course, occasionally a bit of speculation on what might be very early on, but usually accurate information got out reasonably fast. But apart from anything, the manufacturers were very proud to show off what they could do. But over the course of the 1900s, i.e. 1900 to 1910, you get a fairly quick shift from essentially open source over to almost, not quite, but almost the level of operational security about the next generation of ship design that you would see in the interwar period, in the Cold War, and so on. It's relaxed a little bit these days. But as a result, you have people like Fred Jane, who's trying to go around and put together the latest iteration of his book. And you have this mix of some information being out there and, the regular methods that you would normally use to gather said information. But some of those people will have been told to shut up. Other people will have been given false stories, and still other people will have deliberately been told to spread false stories to try and conceal what's going on. I mean, around exactly this time, the design work on Invincible is getting worked up, and of course, the British led a rather successful counter-information campaign that meant everybody thought Invincible was going to have an all 9.2-inch battery, not a 12-inch battery. So you've got a mixture of half information, completely false information, and in some cases lack of information from what would previously have been reliable sources going around, which means that either you end up swallowing one of the false stories and printing that as fact, or you maybe come across 2 or 3 different competing versions of events and you try and parse out from that what might actually be the case and, potentially get it wrong, which is what happened there. It is rather interesting if you happen to have access to Jane's fighting ships from about 1904 through to about 1910, the level of speculation that goes on pretty much across the board as to what the capabilities of new ships are going to be. Farragut's Frog Gut Forger Foraging for 4 Forgotten Frog Guts for 4 Frog Gut Friar Fair asks, I got to talk to a World War II US Navy veteran who said that because he was not from the same part of the US as the rest of his shipmates, he was assumed to be a snitch sent either by the Navy or the federal government to identify security leaks and sailors who were not fulfilling their duties. The question from me is, how prevalent were these spies in the US Navy in World War II, and did they ever do anything of note, either in combat or in their more covert duty? Honestly, I have no idea. I've not come across this part of naval history before. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it's just not a field that I have looked into, researched, or found mentioned all that much. Now, to be fair, I wouldn't be surprised if either the Navy or the federal government, although I would suspect perhaps more so the Navy or whatever the internal security services of the US were at the time, might well plant members of their organizations aboard US Navy ships to try and work out if there are security leaks and so forth. I think, undercover commissars to work out who's shirking their duties is probably stretching it a little bit. But, certainly if there's a concern that a security leak appears to have been made, and they seem to have tracked it down to the potentially 1 or 2 ships, I can see maybe a couple of people being assigned to try and work out if that was actually so. But, one, as that's supposition on my part, it just seems reasonable, but I have no particular proof one way or the other. And second, one would hope that if you are going to try such a thing, you would at least look over the crew enlistment and service records and go, the majority of the crew of this ship are from random US state, Ohio. So we should probably find someone from Ohio so they kind of fit in, or at least someone from somewhere near adjacent, as opposed to, sending someone from Florida in instead. But, that's fairly basic fieldcraft, and you'd hope they'd get it right. But then on the other hand, it is government agencies, so it doesn't necessarily always have to occur. But yeah, sorry I can't be particularly more clear or helpful. But, if anyone, again, who has been in the Navy knows of verifiable instances, or at least strong suspicions, where somebody has been transferred aboard who either was or was likely to have been some kind of silent observer, then let us know. Ibereg asks, during the night of June 20th, 1941, U-203 spotted USS Texas in a designated blockade zone and radioed German High Command twice asking for permission to fire upon it, only for the permission to be denied. What kind of visibility conditions would need to be in place for U-203 to misidentify Texas as a British battleship, and how plausible would those conditions need to be? So something about this didn't quite add up. The problem is there's a lot that's been written about U-203's encounter with USS Texas, and a fair amount of it is mildly contradictory. And, they all agree that U-203 came across Texas, but whether she was able to get into a firing position and orders to attack were refused, whether she wasn't able to get into a firing position, whether she thought Texas was British, whether she recognized who Texas was but wanted to attack anyway, all of these have the various sources have disagreements. However, the more reliable ones, and indeed the majority in any case, seem to agree that U-203 stalked Texas for quite some time. And the older ones, the ones closer to the period, seem to think that U-203 wasn't able to get into position to attack, even if it wanted to. So it may have requested permission, but the balance, at least to me, seems to be that U-203 didn't actually attain a firing solution at any point, at least not one that was viable enough for them to give it a shot. And again, balance of sources seems to indicate that, unsurprisingly, having stalked the ship for several hours, U-203's commander was not in any under any delusion that this was a British battleship, i.e. something like a Revenge class, albeit I can see in darkness, if you only had a silhouette to work with from certain angles, Texas might be mistaken for an R class. But the more likely thing, which is apparently, according to a couple of books, what was stated by U-203's captain afterwards, was that because Texas had moved to the east of the neutrality patrol zone and was, in the area that was under German blockade officially, i.e. should have only be British warships, the captain assumed or supposed that Texas had been transferred to the Royal Navy, and so she was now a British battleship, even though he knew that she was a New York-class battleship. Obviously, as it occurred, he didn't open fire for whatever particular reason. But as I said, in theory, if you're looking through a periscope where it's dark and you can only see a vague silhouette, I can understand maybe mistaking Texas for an R-class, but based on my reading of the sources, I don't think that's what happened. Or at least that's not what the U-203's captain seems to have said. How many Blackburns could a Blackburn burn if a Blackburn could burn Blackburns? Asks, how might HMS Hood's refit have gone if it was done pre-World War II? Say she suffers a major engineering casualty or something in the mid to late 1930s in an exercise that causes her to go in for a refit early. How would this compare to the refit in your refit of HMS Hood, What If She'd Survived video? So I think some of the broad strokes of the refit that I proposed versus a refit in this scenario would have been roughly similar. I'm showing one of the images of my refit because none of the photo mock-ups, etc., that have been done of other potential Hood refits have quite got what I would have in mind. So when you look at the sketch plans, option A, option B, the main thing that a lot of proposed Hood refits miss, which I always tend to look for, is aft. So aft, originally, Hood's X and Y turrets are separate from the superstructure, but it's made very clear, okay, admittedly, these are sketch plans, so not finalised, but it is made clear in both of the existing sketch plans that there is a plan to extend the aft superstructure to join up with X turret, which is what you can see here. So I think that definitely would have happened. Now, what my proposed refit was supposing that Hood was hit but survives the Battle of Denmark Strait, and then essentially cannibalizes parts that have been made ready for Vanguard. That is why she has, for example, a 5.25-inch. A late 1930s Hood refit, that is probably going to be the single biggest and most obvious visual change, because in the mid to late 1930s, 5.25-inch mounts were desperately hard to come by, to the point that ships that were supposed to be carrying them, like the Didos, didn't in some cases. They either carried fewer or none. And so I think what you would see is, instead of a King George V style pyramidal arrangement, you would see the 4.5-inch pancakes, the twin 4.5s, which you see on Renown, Valiant, and Queen Elizabeth. And we know that those were actually a thing that was under consideration in the sketch plans as well. So instead of having the aforementioned pyramid arrangement, I think what you would see if you were looking at, say, this and changing it to a late 30s one would be, you would have 2, maybe 3 twin 4.5-inch mounts aft of the aircraft handling facility, all on a level. So that higher up one would drop down. And then forward, again, you would have, well, I think definitely 3 twin 4.5s running forward. Again, the one that's been raised super firing here would drop down all on a level. So you would have either 10 or 12 twin 4.5-inch mounts. 10, of course, is what Renown got, Valiant and QE. With Hood being just that little bit larger, there is the scope, potentially, for another pair, making 12. And, you know, with no materials hanging over for the construction of Vanguard, then you would obviously have probably just refitting her existing turrets. Then you would also have perhaps a slightly more Renown style bridge superstructure and a generally slightly reduced superstructure overall, and more pom-poms, less orlicans. And then probably at some point in the mid-war period, when aircraft become no longer really necessary and there's more and more radar being installed, then the aircraft handling facility would disappear. And I suspect, based on what they did to Belfast and some other ships that had the aircraft handling facilities pulled, you might actually see the aircraft launch area there basically plated over to create a bit more internal superstructure space. John M. asks, as Titanic was sinking and firing off distress rockets, watch officers on the Californian saw this. Why did it not occur to at least one of the 4 officers, Captain Lord aside, to wake up the radio operator and see what he could find out? I understand the captain being older, perhaps wary of radio and wouldn't think of it, but the other 4 officers, being younger and more in tune with the then state-of-the-art technology, should have shown common sense and done that. Shooting rockets in an empty sea at night is not a passenger entertainment. Well, in part, it's, the structure of authority on the vessel. If the captain is aware of the situation and has made a decision, going around behind his back to change that is, somewhat frowned upon. But also, to be entirely fair to them, Californian and Captain Lord of Californian had actually instructed attempts to communicate with the vessel that they could see via signal lamp, via Morse code. And at the range that they appeared to have been from each other, and we know Titanic was trying to signal at one point with its own signal lights, in theory, the 2 ships should have seen and been able to communicate with each other via signal lamp. But of course, this gets into the whole argument that's been ongoing almost since the Titanic slipped under the water for the last time, of exactly how far away from Titanic was Californian, because by most of the accounts, they were within direct visual range, and Californian should have seen Titanic trying to signal, and Titanic should have seen Californian trying to signal. And why they didn't talk to each other then becomes quite a bit of a mystery, which also explains why the Californian's officers wouldn't necessarily think to use the radio, because, well, if you can see the ship on the horizon, know it's within signal lamp range, you're flashing your signal lamp at it. If it's not choosing to respond, well, what more can you do? Why would you assume that they would respond to radio if they're not responding to signal lamp? But of course, as I said, that leads into the whole thing of, was Californian actually within direct line of sight, or was there some kind of optical refraction going on because of the extremely cold air of the night, which is a theory that's been put forward once or twice. Personally, I lean towards the opinion that given that Carpathia was further away than Californian, if Californian had gone in initially, and of course with the distress rockets and everything, Californian had earlier notice of Titanic's problems, there could have been a lot more lives saved. Exactly how many, when Californian would have arrived, what other things might have occurred, that's all up for debate. But in terms of not using the radio, I think they just didn't think of it because they thought they were using measures that should, in theory, have worked. Silderon Machine Works asks, the deadliest maritime disaster in US history was caused by a boiler explosion on the Mississippi River steamboat Sultana. Similarly, numerous locomotive and industrial boilers have exploded throughout history. How frequently did this problem occur on warships? Were any warships disabled or destroyed by a boiler explosion, particularly outside of a combat situation? I don't know of any ships, or at least major warships, that were destroyed by boiler explosions. There were a good number of warships that were temporarily disabled by boiler explosions. Here's an example on board HMS Thunderer. She had a boiler cook-off to quite some dramatic effect. But most warships are obviously fairly large, fairly well put together, especially compared to merchant and civilian vessels. They usually also have more than one boiler, and there's usually some form of protection around their machinery spaces, mostly to avoid hits coming in, and mines and so forth. But obviously this helps to contain and direct the explosions of boilers when that explosion is venting out, which perhaps explains why large warships don't tend to be sunk by them. And obviously with multiple boilers in place, because most warships will have multiple sets of boilers because they need to go fairly quickly, even if you lose a boiler room, you usually have at least some power. So you might be temporarily disabled, but usually you can get going afterwards once the initial ruckus has dissipated. In terms of how frequent the problem was, it's more common in the late 19th century. It basically peters out the more and more boilers and the technology surrounding them are improved. In older periods in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, when boilers are a much newer technology aboard ships and the relative power is increasing quite a lot more than it would later on, that's when you start to get failures, like you can see here with Thunderer. Because the thing is, you've got to remember, even if you're talking about a 600 psi system in World War II versus a 300, 350 psi system, so US Navy versus Royal Navy, for example, yes, it's just under doubling the pressure, which, okay, that sounds like a lot. But when you look at the operating pressure of, say, the boilers on and engines aboard HMS Warrior compared to the pressures on Thunderer compared to the pressures on Majestic, the proportional increase in pressure is considerably more than just double. Now, that, of course, means stresses are imparted, which in the previous generation of boilers might have been absolutely fine. In the new generation of boilers, yeah, maybe not so much. So yeah, it dies away as time goes on, although never entirely goes away. But one area where you do get a fair amount of boiler explosions tends to be when ships are sinking. Obviously, if they're sinking in combat situations, they tend to sink a bit more dramatically quickly. And boilers are obviously very, very hot. And if you get a sudden influx of freezing cold seawater, which touches the sides of the boiler, what you can get is an effect very similar to if you have a filament bulb, a glass filament bulb, and you let it run for an hour or so it's really, really hot, and then you pour a can of water over it. The sudden cooling will cause the glass to contract, it will crack, shatter, boom, no more light. as I found out when I was a kid, because I noticed putting little drops of water on my bedside lamp made it go hiss, and I thought, oh, this was fun. So eventually I filled up half an empty Coke can with water and went, oh, I can get lots and lots of hiss, and no, it went bang. Yeah, my parents were not pleased. Anyway, the same thing essentially can happen with ship's boilers. And personal theory of mine, can't necessarily prove it at the moment 100%, apart from anything. The only records we have is one set of film of it. But my personal theory, at least, is that there was a boiler explosion involved in the sinking of HMS Barham, or possibly more than one, mainly due to the exact timing and nature of when the initial explosion occurs as she rolls over, as well as the fact that when you actually look at it, the colour and nature of the smoke, well, quote-unquote smoke, could be steam, that's coming out from Barham when she goes up, does seem to indicate two different kinds of explosion are going on. So, as I said, my personal theory is that as she went over, potentially the boilers blew up when water came pouring down her funnel, and then either that explosion itself or the scattering of burning fuel along with that explosion is what almost immediately thereafter set off the magazines. But as I said, that's my personal observation. Have a look through the footage if you want to come to your own opinions. And in general, where we know boiler explosions occurred as ships were sinking, it certainly accelerated the process. Emil asks, I've read about the supposed use of older black powder pistols like flintlocks being able to be reversed and held by the barrel and then used as a club in naval boarding actions alongside a sword or cutlass. Was this at all true? And if it was, is there a specific term for it? I don't know if there's a specific term for it, but it certainly does seem to have occurred. And in some pistols, you do seem to actually see modifications which are not really necessary for it to be used well as a firearm, but would perhaps make sense if you were intending to use it as a club. For example, look at this one. It's got that metal cap on the bottom of the grip. That serves no real purpose that a good, well-rounded wooden cap wouldn't do, or just, the stock itself, unless you're planning to bash someone over the head with it. However, with that said, I think sometimes the use of pistols as clubs does get a little bit overemphasized. For one thing, if you have a cutlass or a sword or really almost anything, you are going to have a longer range and more effective weapon than a reversed pistol. And so at best you're going to be using it as an offhand weapon. And on top of that, that flintlock mechanism, whilst it's not fragile, it's not the most durable of things if you're going to go bashing it around on people and other weapons and so on and so forth. So, you don't necessarily want to break your relatively expensive pistol if you can at all avoid it. Now, on the other hand, again, you're in a fight for your life, at which point, a broken flintlock mechanism and you being alive is much better than an intact flintlock mechanism and you being dead. So, needs must, if you absolutely have to, you would. But you've also got to remember that where at all possible, a lot of sailors would carry what they call a brace of pistols, i.e. two. Some people were famous for carrying even more. So if you did discharge your pistol, perhaps in the course of boarding a ship, you were more likely, if you get the moment, to try and holster that one and draw your other one, because if you are then fighting with two weapons, let's say a flintlock pistol and a cutlass, you will be able to be a considerably more effective combatant because you have the ability to shoot someone rather than just batter them over the head with a short piece of wood and metal, which, is probably going to preserve your life a bit more. And if you do end up having to use it, then you can use it as a club. So very definitely it did happen, but I think it would be much more a weapon of absolute last resort rather than a, hey, I have a pistol, therefore I also have a club, therefore I'm fine kind of thing. If you get to the point where in a boarding action where you might have axes and cutlasses and possibly pikes and daggers and loaded pistols, when you get to the point where I'm hitting someone over the head with my spent pistol, something has probably gone mildly wrong. Kevin Weber asks, I spend a lot of time in the Gulf of Mexico and have seen many waterspouts. They can be very beautiful. Fortunately, they're usually, relatively speaking, weak, slow, and easily avoidable if you're under power or sail, and they tend to be a bit short-lived. I've read the account of the bark Trovatore, but I can't find much else. Are you aware of any other notable encounters, or were waterspout instances as rare as they seem to be? Incidents with waterspouts that are anything other than mildly irritating are relatively rare, but that's because, as I'm sure you know, but for the audience, most waterspouts are relatively weak. They're more flashy than they are destructive, but you do get stronger waterspouts in some areas that are more like tornadoes that happen to have formed over the sea, as in, the strength and power of them. Obviously, as was mentioned, the Trovatore, which was in the Mediterranean, which is where a lot of the so-called tornadic waterspouts form, was actually wrecked by one. There aren't too many recorded encounters with them, although, at the same time one might ask, well, a ship that's hit by a full-on tornado that's flinging around tons and tons of water may not have any survivors, so that might explain the paucity of records. And, ships do randomly up and disappear at times, especially the further back in history you go, so maybe some of them were victims of waterspouts and so forth. But at the end of the day, we don't have many confirmed accounts. What we do have, though, is an account from the 1550s where a very powerful waterspout entered the Grand Harbour in Malta and sank 4 galleys of the Order of St. John, who obviously at the time were in charge of Malta. That would probably be the single most devastating interaction between waterspouts and shipping that I'm aware of. Outside of that, as I say, I rather suspect, especially in the Mediterranean, that a percentage of ships, especially medieval and earlier ships that just up and vanished, were probably hit by some kind of tornadic waterspout. But that's probably about as far as it goes, I think. These days, you'd have to be a relatively small vessel to be in serious danger from being hit by even a tornadic waterspout. Although, even on a cruise ship or on some other kind of large vessel, it still wouldn't be a pleasant experience, to say the least. And that brings us to the end of this week's Patreon Drydock. As I said before, when you're listening to this, if you're listening to this on the day of public release, I've probably only just touched down back in the UK. So the second half will be complete, hopefully, and ready for upload next week, as is the case with most months where I do overseas trips. So see you then. Bye.